The City Attorney, please present the first item on the agenda.
First item on the agenda is a discussion of O1221, police enhancement and community engagement.
Yeah. Police Jackson, Chief Jackson, please come forward. And your team.
Good afternoon. Before I get started, I'm going to give opening remarks. I'll keep those brief. I like an opportunity to also kind of close once the presentation's been completed. As you can see behind me, I have some of the best people you'll find anywhere. Some of the finest police officers you'll find anywhere in the state of Maryland. And I would argue anywhere in the United States that you travel, you won't find a finer group of men and women who work hard each and every day and multitask. And each one of them, they're here because they love the department, they love the city, and they're very grateful for the opportunity to serve. The way we are going to present this, we have a PowerPoint presentation. And I think what's unique about this is that each and every person who has a responsibility to go out and provide the type of service that the citizens I know appreciate will present and talk about what they do. Everything from CID, which investigates all crimes against persons and crimes against property that are of a serious nature, like homicides and burglaries and robberies and rapes. Many of them do that in addition to investigate one of the most difficult crimes to investigate, and that's homicide. We're going to hear from the patrol commander. We're going to hear from people like Rhonda McCoy, who we just brought on. We're going to hear from the deputy chief. We're going to hear from Acting Captain Klondis and his people. We're going to hear from Acting Captain Mike McDonald and his people. We're going to hear from Al Kalia, standards person, Miguel Dennis. We're going to hear from our captain, acting captain in charge of administration, Dave Maguez. And so that's not everybody. Those are some of the highlights and some of the leadership that you'll hear from, and the people who report to them will also be talking as well. So having said that, I think we can get started.
I would just ask, once we get started, whoever's going to be presenting probably come up and sit next to me. I think there's only other microphone that's available. So whenever you guys are ready, we'll get started. So,
Can I just ask the city manager, so was it any word from Alderman Savage on today's work session or Alderman Gay?
No, but I will check to see if they're on their way.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
did you want us to delay till they get here? All right. So we're going to start off with the administration department. We're going to go through and hopefully, and this is no indication of what you guys know and don't know about policing. I would not assume, or you shouldn't assume, that I know everything there is about doing the jobs that you guys do. So this is just an educational piece to make sure you guys understand what we do on a daily basis, how the department is structured and how we do things on a daily basis, and maybe be able to explain some things that you always been wondering about that we can explain to you. So with that, I turn it over to Lieutenant Miguez, the commander of the Administration Bureau.
Good afternoon. At the police department, we currently have 191 positions at our department. 161 of them are currently filled. In our sworn ranks, we have 106 currently filled out of 124, and on the civilian side, 50 out of 67. Up there you see the breakdown between the sworn and civilian. The department is made up of 4 main organizational components: the Office of the Chief, Patrol Division, Special Operations or Operations Division, and Administration. Here you can see what our current numbers are in those 4 different divisions. Normally, our patrol, and that's the face of the department for the most part is the Patrol Division. When people call the police, more often than not, it's a patrol officer that's going out to respond. Special Operations also has a lot of sworn positions in there as well. And so the specialized units where you'll see K-9 and traffic officers, detectives, they'll also respond out to calls as well. But the bulk of it is the Patrol Division. And I'll let Acting Captain Kleinitz get into his staffing there. Our civilian positions, and we're not uncommon from other police departments where our civilian positions, the numbers are somewhere at about 50% of our sworn. They're comprised of communications, which is our dispatchers, and then administrative services. The bulk of the rest of them are within our records section, but we have citywide camera monitor. You can see on the list there. We have 1 crime analyst. So some of those are just individual positions. Some of them are a grouping of positions like crossing guards. We have probably, I think, about 16 crossing guard positions. We have 1 cold case investigator position. Go ahead. And with the CALEA certification, I'm going to leave that to
Miguel Dennis.
Mr. Miguel Dennis.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, alderpersons. Thank you for this opportunity today to speak before you, and talk about the CALEA process. By way of introduction, my name is Miguel Dennis, retired captain with the Maryland State Police after 32 years, retired chief of police for the town of St. Michael's, currently the accreditation manager for the Annapolis Police Department. With that being said, accreditation is a third-party confirmation that an organization is qualified to perform a particular activity. Accreditation is a systematic internal review of policies, procedures, training, and operations, all of which are measured against an accrediting body's standards manual to prove compliance. Agencies conduct self-assessments before the accrediting body assessors arrive for a formal on-site assessment to validate compliance. That accrediting body is CALEA, which stands for the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. The commission itself is composed of it's composed of 21 persons, 11 of whom are from law enforcement. The other 10 are selected from the rank and file, business leaders, politicians, educators, etc. Accreditation is a self-initiated process and voluntary where agencies operate within a specific set of state and nationally recognized standards or best practices within the industry. CALEA was formed in 1979 by the 4, at that time, leading law enforcement organizations in the country, that being the International Association of Chiefs of Police, NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, National Sheriff's Association, otherwise known as NSA, and PERF, which is the Police Executive Research Forum. And to maintain and improve compliance with these standards, agencies have to develop policies, training, and accountability for 3 things: high liability areas such as vehicle pursuits, vehicle operations, critical incident response, investigative techniques, use of force, etc. Number 2, personnel management, and number 3, evidence handling. To that end, there were 189 standards that the department must come into compliance with each and every year. The cycle is a 4-year process. However, each and every year during that process, there's a review. At the 4th year, that's when the assessors come in, outside assessors come in, review what we've done for the last 4 years to make sure we're in total compliance with CALEA. When the assessors do come in, the public is invited, the politicians are invited, educators are invited to come in and talk about or speak about the police department, how they view the police department, et cetera. And that becomes very important to the assessors. Now, we haven't had a live assessment since the pandemic hit, but we did successfully last year on March 20th receive our accreditation with meritorious honors. What that means is for the past 15 years, let me say that again, for the past 15 years, we've come into compliance with CALEA standards. Why is it important? Accreditation helps police departments operate more professionally, justify their operations, and promote trust in their community. Most accreditation programs require agencies to assess high liability areas of their operations, provide officers more training, and hold officers accountable to policy and training compliance. Accreditation also promotes transparency and self-reflection within an agency, which fosters a culture of accountability. What are the benefits, you might ask? Well, one of the benefits is certainly to the employees of the Annapolis Police Department, where they can have a sense of pride that they work for an accredited organization. An additional benefit is monetary, in that through our insurance carrier, which is legit, Local Government Insurance Trust, our rates are to cover our policies, self-insured, are lower between 5 and approximately 5 and 10% to protect us for liability, lawsuits, employee injuries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because we have a certain group of standards that have been promulgated by the CALEA assessors through the accreditation process. Let me get my notes mixed up here. If you ever noticed at the bottom of your the letterhead paper for the Annapolis Police Department, I don't know if you ever really paid attention to it, but I wanted to bring this to your attention. At the bottom of your letterhead paper for the police department, look at the very bottom, there's a seal there. And it also denotes that we're an accredited agency. Okay, and I think that's very important. Not only for us, but as we send information correspondence from the chief or deputy chief or any of our partners here, my fellow co-workers, that agencies that we deal with, entities that we deal with, know we're an accredited police department. That's basically all I have, unless there are any questions. Oh, wait a minute, I did miss something, I'm sorry. The standards are promulgated every year by CALEA through their Standards Review and Interpretation Committee. I just received some new standards yesterday, and I want to read this to you so you have some idea of how involved these standards are. And again, there are 189 of them. This is standard 4.1.8, termination of and reduction of the use of force. And it reads thusly: a written directive states in situations when the subject either ceases to resist or is under control, the use of force must be terminated or be reasonably reduced. Personnel actively engaged in the application of force must ensure the use of force does not continue beyond the point that is unreasonable. There's more, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. So not only do we have to show that we adhere to that standard, we have to prove it. How do we prove it? We prove it through our reporting, through our report process, where we look at some reports that the officers have submitted, where they've used force, and we review that arrest, that emergency petition, whatever reason may have to use force on an individual. That's just some of the things that CALEA promulgates that we all try to follow, or that we do follow, thus our reaccreditation for the last 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Annette?
Thank you. Chief, this is not a question, it's a request. Both of the presenters we don't even have the PowerPoint. We'd like to get that, but you've given us a lot more information that was in the PowerPoint, and some of us are really starting to dig in as we look at the peace initiative and very valuable information. It would really be helpful if we can get that detail. We promise we will look at it if you give it to us.
Oh, yes, sir.
Good.
Yes, sir. You'll have a copy.
Thank you.
Yep, we good. Just to add
I'm
to
going to
what,
request that you
I'm sorry.
guys don't ask for any questions until the whole presentation is over. Is that
Right.
okay? Thank
Yeah. So as the next presenter coming up, I think is Miguez coming back up again?
Yes, sir.
So just to add to that, the process for the CALEA, I know he mentioned that it's open to the public. So part of getting that information out to the public, we use every media platform that we can. They have an opportunity to meet one-on-one or in a public forum. Also, it is available to any elected official. I think Alderwoman Pendel Charles, I think you spoke to them last when they came in. So it's very informative. It's an opportunity to sit down and ask those questions. There is a report that's generated that's available to you guys. We can make sure you get it. But what they do is evidence-based, and some of the things that you're looking for to see if we're in compliance is in that report.
Yes, and as a council and as citizens at large, we will have to find a way to encourage the public to take advantage of that process. It's very informal, as Alderwoman Pendel Charles could attest to. You more or less have a conversation with them. And so it's not like an inquisition. I think some people feel intimidated when you say the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, but its sole aim is to garner information as to how we perform our duties and the quality of service that we provide to the public. So one of the things that we need to do, Deputy Chief, along with our public information people and the city, should help us with that, to get the information out there so we can have better participation when the CALEA assessors are back in town next time.
Dave?
Okay, so moving on to training, the training that our officers receive from their initial hire through ongoing training. It starts out with academy training. All officers, police officers, sworn police officers in the state of Maryland have to be certified through the Maryland Police Training Commission. They have to attend an entry-level training academy. We don't have our own academy, and so we send our officers to area academies such as Baltimore County, Maryland Transportation Authority Police, Baltimore City, Anne Arundel County, and the Training Commission actually has their own academy as well, and we've sent officers there. It's 750 hours of training. Depending on which academy you go to, it's somewhere between a 6-month and 8-month academy. During that training, they cover topics such as emergency medical care, crisis intervention, training in the proper level and use of force, sensitivity to cultural and gender diversity, and individuals with physical, intellectual, developmental, and psychiatric disabilities. Once they graduate from the academy, they come back to the police department, and we have 1 or 2 days of what we call gap training, where we integrate what they learned in the academy with our agency-specific policies, procedures, and city code laws, things that they wouldn't have learned there in the academy. After that, they then go on to field training. That's a minimum of 360 hours of training, which is about 2 months. And that's where a certified field training officer gives them on-the-job training on how to do all the aspects of the job. And then once they complete that successfully, then they're released on their own, and they're still on probation at that point. The city code requires, between 12 and 18 months for probation for employees. At the police department, for our sworn officers, they're on probation for 18 months. So they're on the road, they're good. The Training Commission also requires police departments to conduct annual in-service training. And so there's a minimum of 18 hours annually, and it covers subjects such as CPR, sex offenses, treatment of victims and victims' rights, identity fraud, mental health, bias-based training. So that's completed on an annual basis. As Mr. Dennis said, with the CALIA accreditation, there is some additional training required in order to maintain the certification. And so there's additional training done for CALIA. And then, of course, there's classes and trainings that come up that officers put in for, that they find, or if we find that someone needs a particular training, then we seek that out and send them to that. So there's always ongoing training that people are attending throughout the year. And also part of the use of force training is also de-escalation. And so I just want to make sure I mentioned that. Let's see, conduct training. Yeah, so there's the annual in-service training in that slide, legal updates. And legal updates, it's always evolving. And so we are not only training on things that are required by certification, but then also as case law comes down, whether it's even just local at the district or circuit court level, or from state courts or federal courts or the Supreme Court, it's always ongoing, and the state's attorney, someone from the state's attorney's office comes in to make sure that we're up to date on case law and making sure that our training, that our policies and our procedures are matching what's being passed down through the courts through case law. Specialized training, if somebody ends up, if they put in for a specialized unit, when they go to that unit, they're required to get specialized training either immediately before or immediately upon getting into that unit, so that they're having training, obviously, that's relevant to the unit that they're assigned to. There's some of the examples up there, the cold case unit for cold case investigations, traffic collision investigations for the crash course, standardized field sobriety tests. I won't read down the whole list.
It's good.
Yep, that's on me.
All right, next we're going to have Patrol Commander come up, Acting Captain Justin Kleindus.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just to give you a real quick idea of what the Patrol Division is and how we operate on a daily basis. So currently, Patrol is comprised of 3 different entities. The actual patrol officers that when you call 911 or call and ask for an officer, you get. There's 4 patrol squads currently assigned to patrol, as well as K-9 and traffic safety. They all now fall under my span of control. Patrol at full staffing is 40 officers. That's just patrol officers. 40, so that's 10 on each shift, and each shift has 2 supervisors. So there's a total of 12 officers per shift at full staffing. Currently, I'm at 35, so I'm 5 short, and that definitely affects our day-to-day numbers as we move through. Having said that, year to date, we have been below minimum staffing approximately 57% of the time. So 57% of our shifts are having to be supplemented with additional officers by paying them overtime due to our staffing shortage. In patrol, there's 2 commanders that work directly underneath me, 2 lieutenants. One's in charge of the day work patrol officers squads, the 2 day work squads, and a midnight lieutenant that is in charge of the 2 midnight squads. I am the acting captain of patrol, so they all fall under my realm. K-9 consists of 5 teams. We're currently at 4, and traffic safety should have a supervisor and 2 officers, and I'm currently at 1 officer in that unit. So I'm 3 officers short between K-9 and traffic safety. So you know how the city's broken down? It's broken down into 6 patrol posts, 11 through 16 as they're numbered. That's just a geographical area where 1 officer is assigned each one of those, and there's typically 1 floater car. So our minimum staffing to go to work every day, minimally we have to have 7 officers and at least 1 supervisor working in the patrol unit. Again, 57% of the time we've been below that number and had to supplement with additional staffing. So daily activities, just a breakdown, and these are just rough estimates for what they do. Some are based on the actual numbers divided up, but when we think about what we do day to day, we have some average times factored in here, so you know exactly what the average officer does. Typically, each patrol officer in their assigned post is going to handle 10 calls for service per day. That includes being the backup officer for their post partner. So just to give you guys an example, the 11 and 12 car tend to go to all the same calls. We don't typically dispatch one car to a call for a variety of reasons. Officer safety, depending on what the nature of the call is, we typically send 2 people. So each officer is handling about 10 calls together total per shift. When you look at the time spent doing that, that equates to about 5 hours out of their 12-hour shift is spent just handling calls for service. If there's an arrest, that can take up to 2 hours when you factor in the time on the call, plus the booking and processing of the arrested subject, the writing up the statement of charges or any paperwork dealing with that arrest, processing any evidence either at the scene or back at the station, transporting them to and from the scene back to the station for that booking and process, and then ultimately transferring them to the detention center. What's important to know about the detention center is we don't just drop them off, kick them off at the door, and walk away. They have to actually be received by the intake personnel over there before our officers are free and clear to leave. Depending on how busy they are, that can take some time. They can spend upwards of 30 minutes to an hour, maybe longer, depending on how busy the intake is that night. 2 hours approximately spent out of their day doing frequent checks. Those come in all shapes and forms, either through businesses call us and say, hey, our alarm's not working. Can you keep check on the bank overnight for us because the alarms are broke? Residents that go out of town that say, hey, our alarm is set, but we're going to be going on vacation. Can you keep checking on our house while we're gone? Or victims of domestic violence, we can do frequent checks for them. Anybody can call us and submit a frequent check, and we traditionally honor all of those. So we spend about 2 hours doing that. If you factor in the time it takes to get to calls, an average of 2 minutes or less, the officers spend about 20 minutes a day just driving to and from the actual call once it's received. That leaves them about 2 hours for active patrol, a half hour for traffic enforcement, and about 2 hours, I believe, for foot patrol. That's not a whole lot of free time in an officer's day to spend just walking around engaging the community when we're handling a lot of calls. And I'll give you some calls for service numbers in a second. You can see the patrol officers are very busy on a day-to-day. They don't have a lot of free time of not doing anything. It's rare that you're going to see somebody sitting around doing absolutely nothing. If you factor in all this time, if they spent all this time in one shift, that's going to be about 13 to 14 hours out of their day in a 12-hour day. So, these are all on the higher end so that you understand that these things do take time. And that doesn't even factor in, I failed to mention, court appearances. So if a day work patrol officer has to attend court, that pulls them off the street and we're one officer short now. If multiple officers have to attend court, then that happens as well. And we don't get to pick and choose what dates the courts send us to court. The officers get to select as charging officers their court dates, but if they are part and parcel to a different event and now they're a witness officer, they're subject to the arresting officer's court schedule, not their own. So they can spend some significant time in court as well. This does not factor in meals or bathroom breaks. So we have to think about that too, because they can't drive around in their cars for 12 hours without any type of rehydration, eating, or restroom breaks. So January 1st through April 28th, Patrol and the agency has handled about 10,563 calls for service. That equates to 1,304 reports written. Again, those take time out of their day to write the reports, probably about a half hour to an hour on average from the authoring of the report to having it submitted to your supervisor for review if any corrections need to be made or final submittal. They've conducted 774 traffic stops, which resulted in 1,301 traffic citations, warning, and state equipment repair orders. That's the SEROs. That's if your headlight's out or your blinker doesn't work. Those are your equipment repair orders that say you have to get your car functioning. Foot patrol, just from February and March numbers that we pulled, you're looking at about 403.5 hours of doing foot patrol in those 2 months, with 4,516 frequent checks. So when you hear 2 hours of your shift doing frequent checks, well, that's because we've done 4,516 of them. It does take time. A frequent check is not for us driving past your business and looking in and saying everything looks fine because nobody came running out screaming, hollering for help. It's getting out of your car, going in, talking to the business owners, making sure that everything is fine, walking around the resident's house who called and asked for that frequent check to be done, checking windows and doors to make sure that nobody's broken into the building. They do take time. I want to give you guys a quick overview on some of our 3 kind of bigger calls that we handle, so you understand what all goes into them and that you understand the different hats that these officers, we ask them to wear, and the different roles they have to play with different calls for service. So the first one is our mental health overdose calls. That's kind of on the forefront. That's a big pusher right now, especially for this agency with the opioid crisis. So first and foremost, we're going to render aid on the scene if needed, especially with the overdoses. We're going to administer our Narcan, which is the inhibitor or the opioid blocker that hopefully helps revive those individuals that are experiencing an overdose from an opioid, and render whatever medical treatment we can, assess the need for a higher level of treatment, meaning we're going to call for the fire department. And we have to remain on scene. Obviously, we're not just going to call AFD and walk away. If they're suffering from some type of mental health episode or crisis, we're going to contact mobile crisis or a CIT officer to help come start that process and start making their assessments. But one thing that's important, I think, for everybody to understand is mobile crisis will come on any call that we call them for, but they will not come alone if there's a history of weapons, a history of violence, or a history of drug use in the residence. They will require a police officer to be on scene before they will show up. They don't just show up and to those 3 specific areas just without security. And they do it for a reason, because they tend to be the most volatile and can be the most volatile. And, they obviously want their protection. So we have to stand by while they come. Again, depending on their workload. I know I personally stood outside of a residence speaking to a young lady for at least an hour and a half waiting for mobile crisis to arrive. Now, that's not their typical response time, but they do service the entire county as well as the city. So it just depends on what order your call comes into them and how busy they are and how many teams they have working as to when they can get to us. So contacting them is very important. It's one of the things we do for a lot of our calls for service, not just mental health and overdose. If there's any type of emergency petition that has to be filed to take that person in protective custody so they get the treatment and the help that they need, that takes time to fill out. Transport to the hospital. There's another instance where the officer has to wait for the charge nurse or the security to accept the patient before we can just leave. We can't just walk in, drop them off at the waiting room and say, hey, go check yourself in. That's not how it works. We actually have to wait for the charge nurse to come accept that patient. You guys know how busy the hospital can get. Sometimes, again, the officers are standing there for quite a while. I've seen it up to 2 to 3 hours at times, depending on how busy the hospital is. So we can't just leave them. And then we have to complete all the paperwork for that goes into that. That's the petition paperwork plus the report that we write to document that, and the CIT officers have their own paperwork to document as well. The next one is domestic violence. First thing we're obviously going to do is scene security. That's paramount, for the parties involved as well as the officers. This is statistically, just so you guys understand, statistically, the officers that are assaulted the most are assaulted on domestic violence calls. We're not talking about officers being killed in the line of duty. We're just talking about being assaulted. Statistically, this is our greatest threat for being assaulted, is a domestic violence call. So scene security we take very serious. And we have to establish that very, very quickly. And we do that in a variety of ways, simply separating the parties, taking somebody into another room within eyesight of each other, bringing one person outside while the other officer stays inside, keeping an eye on each other so that, if one party decides to go afoul that we still have officer safety and we still have a line of sight on each other. We obviously have to render any medical aid that's necessary on scene. You guys obviously know that with domestic violence, they're not always just verbal. A lot of times they become very violent. So we do have to render aid and make sure that the victims and the suspects are okay medically as well, because we do have an aid or a responsibility to the suspects as well. We have to complete the investigation, find out who the aggressor was, determine what exactly happened, and that takes time by interviewing both parties involved. If there's an arrest that's justified through the investigation and there's enough evidence to warrant the arrest, then that again takes time to take place through the processing and everything else that I explained earlier, booking, charging, and dropping off at the detention center. If we don't arrest somebody on scene for a variety of reasons, maybe the aggressor, we've determined that the aggressor is no longer on scene, they left before our arrival, the officers will then go apply for a statement of charge or apply for an application for charges, which is going to turn into either a summons or a warrant for that individual. The process is slightly different now than it used to be. Everything gets emailed now. We don't actually go before a commissioner and wait for the charges. We can wait via email, and once the charges are issued, we'll then immediately attempt to go find and locate the suspect and serve those charges to offer some protection to our victims, so they're not kind of left out in the lurch wondering, is he going to come back or is she going to come back tonight and finish the deal? We have domestic violence lethality screenings that have to be done for every domestic violence case. That takes time to go through an interview. If they screen in, then that warrants a phone call that we have to call so that they can actually speak to somebody with domestic violence helpline. And that can turn into an even longer process by having them placed in a temporary facility. And then we often will be the ones that do that transport for the family. A lot of times it's, mothers and their children, small children. We do have the means to transport them, but we do take them to an off-site, undisclosed location where they can remain safe. If there's any children involved or there are witnesses, that's an additional layer of time because there's actual phone calls that we have to make or texts that we have to send to certain entities to notify them that the children have witnessed a violent crime or been part of a violent crime. If any one of these can turn into a child protective service call, which again adds more time waiting for an investigator to come out, or maybe they just want to follow up. But all of these layers take a lot of time. And certainly mobile crisis is always offered at domestic violence. The pamphlets are given out to them for victims' rights so they understand what their rights are. It has all the hotline contacts in it so that they can make the notifications to whoever they need to. And the handle with care notification, the last thing you see on there, that's the juveniles if they witness crimes or are a part of crime as a victim. Last one is homicides. Those obviously by their nature are pretty long and in depth. What I want you guys to think about when I'm reading through this is how many officers it takes to manage a homicide scene. All right, it's not going to be a 1 or 2 man job. This is going to be an entire shift thing. And if we're already short, you can imagine we're going to have to start to wear multiple hats and do multiple roles. So first and foremost, scene security. For the people involved, victims, innocent bystanders around, we have to secure the scene, make sure it's safe. The medics will not come into that scene until the police are on scene and say, hey, it's okay for you to come in. There's no longer a threat to you. That takes time getting done sometimes, depending on the size of the crowd that's out there when we show up. It takes manpower and it takes time to get it secure. We're going to start rendering aid immediately, and as needed, we have several officers that are trained in tactical emergency casualty care, which is basically staunching the flow of blood, severe blood loss trauma. It's designed for that. It hopefully starts that golden hour that we always hear about from the medical side. It starts prolonging that hour so that they have a better chance of survival. It has worked in a couple cases. One officer is typically going to go to the hospital with our victim. If they're flown to shock trauma, that's typically one officer we've now lost for several hours up in Baltimore because they have to stay there for any evidentiary items that might be collected off the victim, any statements that might be given from the victim as well. That's all evidence for the crime, and we need to obtain that. So sometimes that takes time. If they are going to land a helicopter, we have to send an officer to the landing zone for security so that the offenders don't come back and try and finish the job if they weren't successful. That takes an additional resource. So out of my 7 cops, I've already lost 2 on my worst case scenario here. So now I'm down to 5 to manage this scene. Obviously, we have to contact CID, locate and review any video footage if there's any around, if people have it on camera, our own in-house cameras that we have footage for, door-to-door canvases for witnesses. A lot of times people will not give us any information, but if we don't ask it, we don't know it, so we make sure we ask it. Transport witnesses, if we locate any on the scene and then take their statements, that's going to take time as well. Contacting CIT and mobile crisis, again, for victim family members or other residents that maybe unfortunately witnessed the trauma in front of them. You know, it's not just dealing with the victim's family. There's other victims involved in homicides. It's the neighborhood, you know, those that witnessed it as well. So we want to attend to everybody's needs, not just the family who may have lost a loved one. Contact our forensic service unit, which is going to come out and process the crime scene. A lot of times they're not at work, so they have to be called in from home. That takes time for them to get there. We certainly can't clear the scene until that's done. So again, we're going to be standing around conducting our investigation, waiting for them. Once that's crime scene canvassing. So typically before FSU's ever called out and starts collecting the evidence, we do kind of a skirmish line with our officers where we walk the crime scene and attempt to locate any additional evidence that we may not have found that was readily apparent upon our arrival. As you can imagine, with a lot of people in a crime scene, especially if it's a shooting, things get kicked around sometimes trying to get to a victim. So maybe where we saw that shell casing originally, it's not there anymore. We need to do that canvas to make sure we collect everything. Locate any secondary victims, i.e. property damage. If somebody goes and shoots up a neighborhood and there's several cars hit, in addition to a person as the victim of a homicide, we do have to locate those people as well and attend to their issues with the property damage. Contacting other agencies for assistance if we need it. Certainly putting any kind of lookouts to other agencies, contacting the local hospital to make sure we don't have additional victims coming in or suspects coming into the hospital. We have to make the family notifications, contact the OCME, that's the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Baltimore, that's going to come and collect the remains of the deceased. We have to wait for a forensic service unit to process the crime scene, and then we have to sit down after all that at some point and write our reports for that. So those are kind of the 3 biggest time-consuming events. And I want you guys to think about our 7 officers. 2 of them are already gone because one victim's being flown to the hospital. So they're with we're with that person in the helicopter, and one's guarding the landing site. And now another call comes out while we're dealing with that. 7 people will tie up very easily with 2 just big events. And it has happened in the past. So 7 people that run the city pretty much after normal business hours are running it. And I was in Chick-fil-A the other day, and they have an average of 45 people working. And I spoke to the manager. 45 people in there to serve chicken sandwiches. And we have 7 on the road at night, 57% of the time trying to staff it with overtime. There's some additional calls for you guys that you can peruse in the PowerPoint when you get it. Just kind of runs down our checklist on everything that we have to do. That shows you the time-consuming nature of some of the calls for service. Just a brief overview of K9. I'll go through this pretty quick. They're engaged in active police operations that require, obviously, their special skill set. One thing I want you guys to understand is the K9s that we use, their primary tool that we use them for is a locating tool. All right? It's not the days of old that you see in the movies where the dogs are out biting everybody and chewing on everybody. Our last apprehension with the bite was in 2016. That's pretty good, all right, with minimal injuries to the suspects, and we only use them for certain calls for service. But their primary function is a detection tool. They're there to protect fellow officers and members of the general public, detect, locate, and apprehend criminal offenders who attempt to elude and resist apprehension. That, again, that's not all criminal offenders. There are certain criteria. We're not just releasing dogs on everybody. That's not how it works. They are a good psychological deterrent for the criminal element. Typically what happens, most of our apprehensions that we consider the dog located and the person gave up is our apprehension. Those are done at a distance with a call out. A lot of times people will just give up when they know the dog is there. It plays a vital role in officer safety and a vital role in locating offenders. One of the other things our canine unit does do a lot of, not so much last year in 2020 due to COVID, but they probably do, I'd say 1 to 2 demos a month, roughly, off the best guess off the top of my head. Last year, obviously, COVID squashed that a lot, but we get a lot of mileage through the public with these demos, where they get to see the dogs interact. The dogs aren't crazy and wild. They're very controlled, and they get to actually see how we utilize the dogs with locating narcotics or locating people. So it really gives them a good insight. It's not a bad recruitment tool either. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, yes. So years past, the canine unit was funded largely by our own budget. Currently, there's the Chesapeake Canine Fund that really supplements a lot of the cost. And out of the 5 existing dogs we have right now, none of those dogs were spent with city money. They weren't bought with city money. Every one of those dogs have been either donated through funds or the dog itself. The average cost to the city for 5 dogs is less than $13,000. Basically what the city covers is routine vet care and food. Because they like to eat, we gotta feed them. So that's pretty much what the city cost is. It's vet care and food, that's it. Everything else is supplemented through donations. Quick overview of traffic safety. Primary function is engaged in traffic enforcement activities to facilitate the safe and efficient flow of vehicular and pedestrian traffic by reducing collisions and injuries. And how do we do that? By going out and enforcing traffic laws. Traditionally, again, it's staffed by a sergeant or a corporal and 2 officers. Right now, it's staffed by 1 officer. They do selective enforcement, i.e. they go out and do whatever it is they choose to do for the day, whether it's radar, stop signs, bus, whatever the issue is. Traffic investigations, also, our traffic safety unit also does the majority of our traffic accidents while they're working. Any departmental vehicles, any MTA buses, any city buses, any taxi cabs, they're the primary investigators for those. They also do traffic control direction. If there's lights out and they're available, they'll do that. They oversee the crossing guards as well to allow the children to get to and from school safely. And year to date, I'm sorry, not year to date, January 1 through April 28th, the traffic safety division itself, or traffic safety unit, 192 traffic stops, 265 citations to include warnings, actual citations and equipment repair orders, 5 arrests for driving under the influence or DUI. And one of their very, very time-consuming functions is the review of all the speed camera and red light tickets that the city issues, which is a revenue generator. To date, 1,477 speed camera citations have been reviewed through the 28th. 1,169 were issued and 308 were rejected. 647 red light camera citations were reviewed and 385 were issued and 262 were rejected. So they have to go through hand by hand each citation, and there's certain criteria to verify that the vehicle and the registration match and that the cameras are functioning properly. There's audits that have to be done, and all that is time consuming.
So criminal investigation gonna be next. Justin stole my Chick-fil-A analogy, so I'm mad with him on that because I was gonna pull that. But other than the homicide call, the rest of those calls are daily occurrences. Those are things that our patrol officers are responding to on a daily basis. As you can see, it's a lot for 7 people. Not only that, what's not included in that, because those calls are calls that's generated through the 911 system. We still get calls through the chief's office, to myself, and we get calls from some of the older persons also for constituent complaints. So not only are they handling those 911 calls, we're still handling those calls that come through our office via your offices or through people contacting the station directly or contacting the chief directly. So it's a lot to deal with.
Yes, and I was going to add real quickly to that. You talk about this all the time, Mayor, in our discussions, and I don't mean to talk out of school, but you always talk about the need to tell our story better. And in a lot of those calls, they're acts that go well above and beyond the call of duty. I would even argue that if we could evaluate each one of those calls and talk to each one of those officers, many officers are very modest. They do things unless a citizen witnesses it or it's so phenomenal that some other medium catches it like a camera. Many officers go beyond the call of duty and they never take credit for the good things that they do. I'm talking about feeding a hungry child, buying a kid a pair of tennis shoes, going back into a residence to sit down with a young man who may be deliberating whether he wants to try to make something productive with his life or enter himself or herself into the criminal justice system through antisocial behavior. And many times our officers will go back and talk to them and impact them to want to do better and reach goals beyond their circumstances. Those kind of things you can't quantify. So I have to, as a part of this presentation today, defend that because I see that we're living in a time in policing where we are forced to tell our story better so that the public can have a real appreciation for the things we do and not the rare bad acts that occur in the United States of America and anywhere else. But I'm off my high horse now. You can start.
Good afternoon. So my goal today is to provide a very brief outline of the Annapolis Police Department operations section, the staffing, basic responsibilities. Please understand that it is impossible to explain all of the complexity and all the jobs that are done by the members, the very dedicated members of the operations division.
What was your name again?
Michael McDonald.
Okay. And what was I didn't catch you.
Lieutenant McDonald, I'm the commander of the operations section.
Thank you.
Alderman Arnett asked earlier about having documentation or information. At the end of this presentation, I do have a folder for each councilman if you'd like them, which will contain a lot of the information I talk about in addition to what's on the PowerPoint. Again, I tend to be as brief as possible. So the Annapolis Police Department Operations Division, the units assigned to it are the Criminal Investigation Section. That's currently staffed with a lieutenant, a sergeant, a corporal, and 8 detectives. The Drug Enforcement Unit, which is staffed with a sergeant, a corporal, 2 detectives, and 2 officers. The Intelligence Section, which is staffed with 1 officer and 1 investigator. The Forensic Services Section, which is staffed with 1 officer. And we have a civilian crime analyst who works out of the Operations Division. The responsibilities of the various units within the division. The Criminal Investigations Section, it's the 8 detectives and their supervisors that work within that unit are required to respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to specific crimes. There are only 8 of them plus their supervisors, so they are obviously not working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It would be physically impossible. So there's an on-call schedule, which they are called from home to come in when one of these crimes occurs and there's a required criminal investigation detective to respond. Those crimes consist of homicides, suicides, unexpected or suspicious deaths, rape, sex offenses, robberies with a weapon, aggravated assaults with a serious injury, missing persons, and kidnappings. Detectives are also responsible for following up and completing the investigations on numerous other crimes. Those crimes are robberies with no weapon, burglaries, thefts, motor vehicle thefts, suspected child abuse or child neglect cases, assaults, frauds, fatal overdoses, crimes drawing unusual amount of public comment or interest, and special investigations. Additionally, criminal investigation detectives routinely help patrol officers gather information through database searches, prepare photographic lineups, help them with victim, suspect, and witness interviews, help them with the authoring and application of search warrants and subpoenas. Just to give you a quick overview of some 2020 information regarding the Criminal Investigation Section from 2020. Detectives were assigned 409 cases for investigation in 2020. That's approximately 50 per detective. Detectives generally have a working caseload, an open caseload that they're working of about 10 to 15 cases. Detectives are required to work varying shifts, to be on call, to attend court. Additionally, there are numerous instances where they are required to come in when off duty. For example, a suspect that is arrested that was wanted for a shooting that they're investigating. If that detective is not on call, but that person is arrested, that detective's getting called to come in to interview that suspect. The complexity of criminal investigations has changed dramatically as technology and the internet have evolved, greatly increasing the work required to effectively investigate reported crime. Examples of the technology are security cameras, closed-circuit television video, cell phones, social media, websites. However, the number of police detectives assigned to the criminal investigation section has not changed for the last 25 years. There were no cell phones 25 years ago. None of the technology that is paramount in our investigative process today. During the course of their investigations, detectives author and obtain an average of 25 search and seizure warrants each month for physical locations, DNA, cell phones, vehicles, social media platforms. Each warrant requires many hours of work after it is executed. A couple examples of that. Data from phones must be examined by the assigned detective. The time process to do the digital examination, extract the data from the phone once the warrant has been obtained, is in and of itself timely. Once that data is obtained, someone has to review it. I'll picture my daughter's phone. I can only imagine the number of texts, emails, photographs, social media sites that have been visited. All of that data is captured in that digital forensics. The detective has to go through every piece of that information to see if there's evidence related to the case he's investigating, which he wrote the warrant for. Information from social media sites such as Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, among many, many others. Imagine the amount of information if we write a warrant for a Snapchat account or an Instagram account or a Facebook account for a period of, say, 6 months. Imagine the amount of information that is contained within that data. Someone has to go through it once we get it. That's the detective. An example of a video, this one, there are communities within Annapolis that have numerous cameras, and for example, if there's a crime that's committed and a detective gets information or gets video from 10 cameras or 5 cameras, and he has to review 10 hours of video, that has to be done real time. We can't fast forward through it. We can't kind of pick our spots. That detective has to look at 50 hours minimum of video, and that's just to see it. He probably will have to review it and go over different parts many times, but minimally you're looking at 50 hours of real-time video for one case. Detectives are also, they obtain subpoenas for financial information, medical information, business records. When the required information is obtained, the detective has to examine it. It doesn't just present the evidence to him, you have to go in and find it. We had a recent case of a suspicious death. The detective wrote a subpoena for medical records. The subpoena came back with over 400 pages of medical records, which he has to go through to find the evidence, or if there is evidence of wrongdoing in that unattended suspicious death. Members of the criminal investigation section, we work routinely and regularly, almost on a daily basis, with police departments in the surrounding area, obviously Anne Arundel County to a large degree. We work with other agencies, Department of Social Services, Child Protective Services, and the Child Advocacy Center. Detectives attend autopsies, communicate with victims and victims' families. The amount of work varies from case to case. However, it is oftentimes, as you may have been able to gather from this presentation, it's often extensive and very involved. Additionally, when possible, we send detectives to training with regard to specific crimes, sex offenses, police-involved shootings, homicide investigations, to help them improve their skill set as an investigator. The next unit I'll talk about is let's see which one we're going to bring up here. The intelligence unit is staffed with 1 officer and 1 investigator. The intelligence unit basically is involved and has its hands in many, many things. I'll try and be fairly quick and hit some of these highlights. They serve as a liaison with the Anne Arundel County and Homeland Security for any security threats to Annapolis. They serve as a contact and a liaison with the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center for any suspicious activity or security-related issues for Annapolis. They conduct threat assessments. They assist with drug investigations. They assist with major crime investigations. They assist with warrant details and fugitive apprehension. They serve as liaison with the state's attorney's office for all video evidence. They serve as liaison with the Annapolis Police Department records section for video release and redaction of video regarding FOIA requests. They obtain and serve subpoenas and search warrants for video. An example of that is a serious assault occurs inside a bar downtown. Detectives go down there, and the management of the bar does not want to voluntarily provide that video. It happens. It's very unfortunate, but it happens at times. The detective or the member of the intelligence unit will have to author a search and seizure warrant, go down and seize the recording information, seize any recording equipment, and be able and actually seize the video from them. Again, time consuming, but that's what they're involved in as well. They conduct alcohol compliance checks. They conduct tobacco compliance checks. They oversee the administration and training and troubleshooting of the body-worn camera program, which is huge. And it's one of the most beneficial pieces of equipment to hit policing. I've been doing it for 34 years in a long, long time. They serve as administrator for evidence.com platform, which is where our body-worn camera and evidence, digital pieces of evidence are stored. They serve as administrator for the license plate reader technology that we have within the city. Next unit is the Drug Enforcement Unit. This will be quick. Drug enforcement, their job, identify organizations involved in the sale of controlled dangerous substance, conduct investigations leading to the arrest of the persons involved in the sale of controlled dangerous substances, obtain search and seizure warrants for locations, phones, vehicles during the course of those investigations, coordinate with partner agents regarding drug investigations. These detectives and members don't have any particular set hours. Oftentimes the investigation dictates when they work. So much like all of police work, you don't get to choose your hours. You don't get to know I work 9 to 5 tomorrow. You might get a call from your supervisor saying, we were going to work day work tomorrow, but now we're working 2 to 10 at night. It's just the nature of the job and the responsibility based on the investigation. The DEU supervisor is required to manage the Maryland Criminal Information Network grant to include the outcomes, the expenditures, and the reporting. They also go to training whenever we can to help them stay abreast of new tactics, transportation methods, storage methods, communication methods, distribution methods. Obviously, in the drug game, the tactics and the methods used are changing all the time. We have to keep our people updated on them. Very quickly, the Forensic Services Unit. We only have one person currently assigned to the Forensic Services Unit. Forensic Services Unit is basically the unit that goes out, processes crime scenes, recovers evidence, transports and moves evidence. They are as vital to successful prosecution of any criminal case as the detective, as the witness testifying. If you don't have your forensics properly handled, you could very well compromise or lose a case. Unfortunately, we only have one person assigned to that unit this time. That person is supplemented by patrol officers who actually wear 2 hats. They're a patrol officer, but they receive training in the processing of a crime scene, recovery of evidence. They go onto an on-call schedule. So they may be at home on a Saturday night watching TV with their family, and there's a shooting, and they will get a phone call, you got to come in and process this crime scene. Those units are also responsible for the storage of evidence, the processing of crime scenes for fingerprints, processing of evidence for fingerprints, processing of evidence for DNA, responsible for the movement of evidence to laboratories for analysis. For example, our ballistics evidence goes to Prince George's County Lab. Our DNA evidence goes to the Maryland State Police Lab. And our fingerprint evidence goes to a contract fingerprint analyst that we have. All of these units are required to attend court. All these units are required to attend in-service training. So there, again, the picture hopefully that you're getting is there's a lot of work, and there are, which you'll see in the information that's provided and on the PowerPoint, you'll see the staffing that's there to provide it. The Annapolis Police Department has members that are recognized by federal law enforcement agents as partners. They're called task force officers, TFOs. We recognize that we need to expand and work with our federal partners. We currently have one sergeant who is a member of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI task force. We have one corporal who's a member of the Drug Enforcement Agency task force. We have one member who's part-time, a detective who's a member of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms task force. And we have one member who is part-time working with the United States Marshals Task Force. So that's kind of, again, a very quick overview. I hope that you understand that there's no way to explain the complexity and everything that goes on to it. And to be perfectly honest, there are many parts of criminal investigation, drug investigation work that you don't want in a public forum. At the end of this, certainly everyone here, I'm sure, will be available to answer any questions you may have. I'm going to move on from special operations to kind of another topic, which is statistical information regarding citizen contacts. And there's a reason for moving in this direction. The next presenter is going to talk to you about internal affairs investigations, number of complaints. So this is something I hope you can compare and contrast the number of contacts that police officers have with the citizens of Annapolis and the kinds of contacts as compared to the complaints, number of complaints that citizens make regarding the Annapolis Police Department. I think it is important to say that police come in contact with members of the community, oftentimes in very stressful, very difficult situations. People that are victims of crimes, witnesses to crimes, people that we are investigating for crimes, people that we are intending to arrest for crimes. Those situations can obviously become volatile. There can be interpretations that the contact or the communication was at least problematic or difficult under the circumstances. And again, I think you'll see a very clear pattern of the number of contacts that the citizens of Annapolis and the police have, and the number of external complaints or times that the citizens make a complaint about an officer's actions. So real quickly, this is what that information, because you won't have the PowerPoint today, I suspect, is going to be in this folder that everyone will have an opportunity to take a look over. The numbers that I'm going to talk about are from 2018, 19, and 2020. Over that period of time, there were 110,000 calls for service. 110,000 calls for service is what can be tracked by data. You can't quantify, and that does not quantify the number of times a citizen just comes up and talks to a police. A citizen comes up and wants to engage with a police officer. The times a police officer walks into a store and talks to people. So there are many unquantifiable contacts between police and citizens. But the number 110,662 is the number over the past 3 years. Over the past 3 years, there have been a total of 1,139 persons arrested for violent crimes. You can see the definition kind of there for violent crimes. It's basically homicides, rapes, robberies, assault, both aggravated and simple, weapons offenses, reckless endangerment, and sex offenses. Again, that's 1,139 people. Total number of arrests, 4,200 over that 3-year period. During that time frame, 2018, 19, and 20, there have been 217 firearms seized as evidence. So seized as evidence can be many things. It can be from a person, from a vehicle, from a crime scene, from a search and seizure warrant. The gist of it is the Annapolis Police Department is regularly engaging with and involved in the investigation of firearms-related offenses. There is a page that references charges. I won't go too deep into that, but what you can look at your leisure is these are the kind of charges that end up being applied to people that have been arrested in the city of Annapolis over that 3-year period, 2018, 19, and 20. And the last statistical information is car stop information with a demographic breakdown. In 2018, there were 3,303 car stops. The demographic breakdown were 48% of the persons stopped were white, 31% were stopped were African American, 15% were stopped were Hispanic. And to save time, 2018 or 2019, 20, and so far in 21, those statistics basically hold almost identical. At this point, I'm complete with my presentation. I will be happy to be here to answer any questions you guys have at the end of this. Sergeant Ascione is going to come up, and like I said, he's going to talk about internal affairs matters, and he's going to talk about complaint numbers that come in. Again, I hope you compare and contrast that to the contact numbers and the amount of times the police are interacting and engaging with citizens. I think you might find it enlightening. Thank you.
Some of the numbers that Lieutenant McDonald just talked about, you will see those similar numbers in the CALEA report. So if you match what he just said to the CALEA report, that will be in there. Also, we just went through a survey police research form. We have that we can provide. You will see those same numbers in that report also. So these aren't numbers that we just pull out of the air. These are numbers that, as McDonald said, that we can verify. That's data driven, and that's the evidence that I talk about when I say that we need to be evidence based when we make certain decisions on certain things. So with that, I turn it over to Sergeant Nacione.
Good afternoon. I'm Sergeant Nacione. I'm the Internal Affairs Sergeant, so I'm the Internal Affairs Investigator for the City of Annapolis Police Department. All right, so the Internal Affairs section is comprised of a lieutenant and a sergeant. I'm the sergeant. And the sergeant's responsible for conducting the internal affairs investigations that are actually assigned to the internal affairs section. So what that means is that not all internal investigations go to the internal affairs section. Sometimes they're conducted by a first line supervisor. Those are generally situations in which there's a relatively simple investigation to be done. An example would be an officer failed to attend court. There's an allegation of discourtesy. They showed up late for work, something of that nature. So it's an investigation that a shift level supervisor can handle. And then there are other investigations which do need to be assigned to internal affairs for follow-up. These would be the ones where significant discipline is more likely. The investigation is going to be more protracted, or it's going to be more complex. So examples of these would be false reports, discrimination, harassment, and excessive force complaints. So those are the types of incidents that you would expect to see in either the first line supervisor or the internal affairs investigator's desk. All the cases that come in are screened by the commander of internal affairs, that's the lieutenant. We actually have software that allows him to monitor all the complaints that come in as they come in. So as a first line supervisor is taking a complaint and typing it into the software, from upstairs he can look down and he can see what type of complaints coming in. So there's really good visibility on it. So I'm going to go over real quickly how complaints come into the police department. They can come in by way of a number of means. The first one is that a citizen can just pick up the phone, call the police department, and say they want to speak to a supervisor about an officer's conduct, the way they handle a call, whatever the case may be. That supervisor will take that complaint, even if that officer is not, even if they're not that officer's direct superior. So there is no, well, I understand you want to talk to me about Officer A's conduct, but Officer A's supervisor doesn't come back for a week, so you're going to have to wait. That doesn't happen. We get complaints from citizens. We take complaints from citizens. There's also a web portal for the Annapolis Police Department. So if they don't want to pick up the phone and call us, they can go online. They can type in the nature of their complaint. They can provide their name. They can make it anonymous if they want. They can give us details about the incident, and then they can provide us with contact information. We can follow up with them once we receive the complaint. They can also come to the lobby if they want to go face-to-face with somebody about something. And again, it doesn't matter who the supervisor is for that particular officer. If they come in, they want to talk to an officer, they want to file a complaint, they can do that. Citizens can also and have also filed complaints with individual officers during routine calls for service. We have had instances where an officer is dispatched to a location for one reason, and then during the handling of that call for service, citizen decides that, you know, I need to tell somebody about this. So they tell that officer who just happened to show up. Our officers have a pre-existing duty to report the misconduct of other officers to a supervisor. That exists in our general orders right now, and I can tell you I've seen it in some of the cases that I've handled. They do it, and we'll actually get into some of that later on as well. So another question that I sometimes get is whether or not we screen out complaints when they come in, and I can tell you that irrespective of how a complaint might seem when it first comes into us, we take the complaint and we investigate it. It doesn't matter how outlandish it might sound. If somebody makes a complaint, it comes in and we investigate it, and there's a disposition on it. And as I said before, anonymous complaints are accepted. We don't screen those out or not investigate them. They're accepted and they're investigated. So aside from, I know I talked about citizens coming in and filing complaints with us, but that's only one portion of the internal affairs complaints that are generated. So the two sources, as we delineate between the two of them, are internal and external sources. And internal sources, anybody who works for the police department, right? So whether it's an officer, a supervisor, it could be somebody in our communications section, it could be a civilian employee. If it's from within the police department, it's an internal complaint. If it's from anywhere else, it's an external complaint. Just keep that in mind, because that becomes important later. There's also a delineation between the nature of the allegation that's submitted. So these are broken down into policy and conduct allegations. The classic example of a policy violation is the proper performance of duties. An officer handles a call for service. A citizen or a supervisor says this should have been handled differently, and that's the allegation. That's a policy violation. And then for conduct violations, the classic example is discourtesy. Someone believes that an officer acted towards them in a manner in which they should not have, or if while showing up on a call for service, a supervisor or another officer notices the conduct of one of their fellow officers, it's still a discourtesy complaint. So as far as the dispositions for internal investigations, there are four. There is sustained, which means that after the investigation's been conducted, the investigator has concluded that, yes, the incident did in fact take place and the officer did not act appropriately. So they were outside of policy. There is not sustained, and in this instance, there's insufficient evidence after the conclusion of the investigation to determine that the incident took place and that the officer acted inappropriately. There's exonerated, which means that after the investigation was conducted, they've determined that, yeah, this incident did take place, but the investigation has shown that the officer's actions were justified and they were appropriate under the circumstances. If somebody files, and a little bit of an explanation about this is that if somebody files a complaint with us, they might not fully understand what our policy is. They might not fully understand what an officer's actions should be. And even if in their complaint, it seems that it might just be something of a misunderstanding, we still take it and we still investigate it. So that's how you can wind up with an exonerated finding. Just one example of how you can. And then there's the unfounded category. So an unfounded incident, there's sufficient proof after the investigation's been conducted that the incident actually didn't take place at all. It was a fabrication. These do happen sometimes, and I will say that body-worn camera footage has assisted us a great deal in coming to one of these four conclusions as a result of these allegations. And for anyone who's not familiar with the standard of proof that we use when we conduct internal investigations, it's a preponderance of the evidence. So in a criminal case, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a pretty hefty burden. But in these administrative investigations, there just has to be a slight tipping of the scales in one direction or the other. Think of it as 51%. So 51%, yeah, this happened, versus 49%, it didn't. It's going to be sustained. So as far as the discipline that's actually handed down, the Annapolis Police Department instituted a disciplinary matrix quite a few years ago. Now, with recently passed state level legislation, our disciplinary matrix will be superseded by one that will be created on the state level, so it'll be uniform across Maryland. But that's not something that we're unfamiliar with because we've been using that same type of system for a while. All right, so here are the complaints. I know the text is kind of small, so I'll go over it a little bit. So the blue bar on the far left, the number for that is 209, and that is the total number of internal affairs complaints that the Annapolis Police Department had from 2018 through 2020 inclusive. So it's a 3-year period, 209 complaints. The bar that's immediately to the right of it, the gray over yellow, that's a breakdown of those 209 complaints. The top bar is 124, and those are our internal complaints. So I can tell you that that comes out to be about 60% of the internal affairs complaints that were generated in total came from within the police department. And that leaves 85 over that 3-year period coming from the public, and that's 40%. So if we break it down a little bit more, the bar that's immediately to the right of that, there's a green section over a blue section. And the green section represents one individual in particular. That individual is a judge in the District Court of Maryland who routinely advises us when a police officer did not show up for court, whether it's criminal, minor traffic, serious traffic. If the judge finds out that an officer didn't show up for court, the judge lets us know about it. So that winds up being 30 out of those 85 total external complaints. So he's averaging about 10 per year. That leaves us with 55 external complaints. I'll refer to those as net external complaints. We'll do it in an income statement format. So that's 26%. That's about 26% of the total complaints for those 3 years are external complaints that actually came from a citizen who is not this one particular judge. And of those 55, we had to the right, there's a little orange bar, 21 of those were discourtesy complaints. And just as I went over before about they're assigned to either internal affairs or the shift level supervisor, and then they're investigated and there's a disposition on them. And I can, again, body worn camera footage helps a great deal when it comes to investigating these complaints. There were 3 sustained findings on these discourtesy complaints. I can tell you that 2 of these 3 came from one officer. The one officer is no longer employed with the city of Annapolis. So that leaves 1. And then the smaller bar to the, one more, yeah. So the smallest bar all the way to the right, that's the representation of external excessive force complaints. There were 5 over a 3-year period. And after investigation, actually none of those were sustained. But there's more. All right. So when it comes to excessive force, where we expect to see this more often than in any other aspect of law enforcement is during arrest. All right. So as Lieutenant McDonald went over earlier, and we drew from the same time period for our statistics, that bar on the left, the blue one, that is a representation of all arrests from 2018, 2019, and 2020. So that's 4,200. All right. The orange bar next to it, that was the total internal affairs complaints for 2018, 2019, and 2020. That was the largest bar on the last chart. That's just to give you an idea about scale. All right. The bar next to it is the same thing as on the other chart, where it's internal versus external.
We're saving the questions till the end. Thank you.
And the bar next to it's the same, judicial external complaints versus citizen external complaints. This is just to give an idea about the scale that we're seeing here. And then, of course, the last bar all the way on the right, that's total external excessive force complaints for that time period. And there is, I believe, one more after this. Yes. Okay. So there is arrests versus use of force. So again, 4,200 arrests all the way on the left. There is a small bar second to the right. That's the small yellow bar. That's the total instances in which officers applied force that needed to be reported. So out of 4,200 arrests, I believe the number for that is 40. Next to that is a breakdown of excessive force complaints, internal and external. There was actually one more internal use excessive force complaint than there were external. So 6 internal, 5 external. And on the right, you would see that there was actually one excessive force complaint that was sustained during that time period. So if you remember from the prior chart, that means that the internal complaint that someone from the Indianapolis Police Department that brought up, that one was sustained. Just to give a general idea for scale. All right. So I know that some police departments and some individuals in the police department shy away from talking about things like terminations. They shy away from talking about things like officers who resigned prior to the conclusion of an investigation for which they may have been terminated. But we're actually going to talk about that today. So this is for the same time period, 2018, 2019, and 2020. We had 9 employees who were either terminated or they resigned during an investigation, which could have resulted in their termination. All right, so 7 were sworn members, 2 were civilian members. And I think this part right here, if we're not going to pay attention to anything else, I think this is probably the most important part. Out of those 9, the number which originated with an external complaint, 0. None of these came from citizens. Each and every one of these came from within the police department. And this wasn't the internal affairs section saying, I want to open up an investigation on this person because I think that there's something going on here. In some cases, these were rank and file officers bringing these issues up. In some cases, civilian employees. In some cases, first line supervisors. So if there's something in here that actually speaks to the willingness and of the members of our police department to police themselves, and something that speaks to the culture of the Indianapolis Police Department, I think this does it right here. I know that there's a lot of talk about a code of silence or something like that that exists within law enforcement agencies. I can't speak for other law enforcement agencies, but looking at this and looking at our department, I don't believe that such a code of silence prevents our members from reporting the misconduct of another member. I think they're willing to do it.
Done. The last presenter, I think it's the last presenter, going to have a member from the union. But just to clarify something that Sergeant Ascione talked about, he talked about the difference between a IA investigation and an investigation that a supervisor would do. Regardless of which one of them initiated the investigation, the process still goes through IA, and the level of review goes all the way up to the chief. So there's not a discipline case that's not reviewed by myself or the chief. it goes through all those levels of review. So at the end of the day, when a case is concluded based on a recommendation, the chief is actually putting his eyes on that investigation, and he's either deciding to go with what was recommended. He look at all the circumstances in that case. If we disagree with it, we send it back. But any supervisor can send it back for reinvestigation if they're not satisfied. So there is a complete process and different steps to review those cases.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Alderwomen, and Aldermen. Thank you for this opportunity to address you. My name is TJ Woolfolk. I've been with the Annapolis Police Department for what will be 12 years this June. I've served in different capacities to include patrol, flex, our honor guard unit, our bike unit, and our crisis negotiation team. I have also served the past 3 chiefs advisory boards to include Chief Jackson. I have been asked to speak as a representative for the members that you see standing back there, and some that aren't here, of Local 400. In my tenure here as an officer, I have never seen morale this low. A member of this great council said on May 3rd, 2021, that if morale is low, the workers aren't going to work as best they could if they don't feel as if they are being invested in. I think it's time we make that investment. Staffing levels are diminishing, causing increased fatigue and burnout. I would hate for what happened to Corporal Keith Hecook, a member of the Del Mar Police Department, to happen here because of low staffing levels. Corporal Hecook was dispatched to a call for service that we normally here in the city would respond to with 2 officers. But because of staffing issues with Corporal Hecook's department, he was the only officer available. So he, like many of us, went alone, not knowing that it would be his last call. If you think this can't happen here in the city of Annapolis, you're sadly mistaken. Just recently, I was on a call when officers went to arrest a subject with an attempt murder warrant. Officers were met by a group of people trying to prevent that arrest. Several police vehicles were damaged by people who were unhappy that the police were taking a person with an attempt murder warrant off the streets. Thankfully, only property was damaged. But that is just one of many situations that could have gone bad as we were outnumbered. As I speak with officers, new and old, there is a sense of unhappiness and instability with the job. Walking through the hallways and asking an officer how they are doing, their response simply sometimes is, "I'm here." This is not indicative of a healthy workplace environment. Officers are being ordered in to meet staffing requirements, which not only impacts the officer, but their families as well. And while we accept this as a part of the job at times, it is simply unsustainable long-term. As vacancies increase due to limited funding resources and more officers continue to become eligible for retirement, fewer officers will be responsible for serving an increasing population with fewer resources, causing officers to become overworked and burned out. Burnout can be extremely costly, mentally, physically, and financially. What is burnout? Job burnout, as defined by the Mayo Clinic, is a special type of work-related stress, a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity. In an era when police suicide and the importance of officer mental wellness is starting to be recognized, we have a responsibility to both officers and citizens to be intentional about creating a healthy work environment for our police. Anyone who is overworked, tired, and fatigued can make poor decisions. We simply cannot afford to have overworked, fatigued officers making critical decisions. This legislation causes undue stress and does not support that effort in creating a healthy work environment and will cause more officers to leave. Retiring and resigning officers are a major concern for union leadership. Social, political, and economic changes simultaneously play a role in shaping the current state of recruitment, selection, and retention for the Annapolis Police Department. A recent poll of officers was conducted. It concluded that 16% of officers have either left or are in the process of leaving or are seriously considering leaving because of the proposed legislation. If the exodus continues, our communities will soon feel the effects. Our hiring process should be long, slow, and a thorough process. This process currently consists of a written test, physical agility test, and personal history questionnaire, an oral interview, a polygraph, extensive background investigation, and last but not least, a psychological exam. These steps are followed to ensure we hire the most qualified individuals. Replacing officers who left or leave could take a great deal of time, and we will be where we are today, understaffed. Members of the police department understand the nationwide struggle to recruit qualified police officers. This legislation, if passed, will make it almost impossible to hire good, qualified personnel. If unable to recruit new officers, it will significantly increase the strain on the remaining few. The reductions proposed will leave our recruitment with a lasting challenge and have a direct impact on the way the Annapolis Police Department is managed. You have heard from the patrol commander that we are using overtime on a daily basis, over 50%, to reach minimum manpower efforts. The goal should be to thoughtfully amend recruitment, hiring practices, with an emphasis on not lowering the standards for officers and the standards for officers that their peers and communities have come to expect. Any hindrance on retention or hiring will result in our communities suffering longer response times and fewer crimes being solved and cleared. Burned out officers who are overworked will affect the quality of life in our communities, ultimately causing a higher increase in criminal activity than what we already are experiencing throughout the city. Union leadership agrees that implementing proven policies and incentives that are reflective of community priorities can advance and improve the agency overall. City management with police leadership should strive to develop opportunities to improve recruitment, selection, and retention. The proposed bill will not assist in these efforts. We are the state capital, home to the Anne Arundel County Executive, the United States Naval Academy, St. John's College, and over 2 million visitors a year. Comparisons to other jurisdictions are unwarranted and unjustified. Bowie, Baltimore, Louisville, and Minneapolis are not like Annapolis, but they should strive to be. Every day, we work hard to protect and serve the citizens and visitors of this great city. We serve with pride, professionalism, and dedication, from our community services, fishing trips with youths on the Chesapeake Bay, to the 60-second response time to an active shooter at 888 Bestgate Road, where our officers seamlessly integrated with other officers from surrounding agencies to apprehend the suspect. You have heard from a host of command staff the numbers in calls for service, armed encounters, use of force reporting, complaints alleged, complaints investigated, and complaints sustained, and use of force statistics. There is no comparisons based on our actions. Founded in 1867 and over 150 years old, the Annapolis Police Department has professional members who chose to miss holidays, family gatherings, birthdays, and many other landmark family occasions. Why? So our citizens can rest comfortably in their homes. We are mothers, brothers, fathers, sisters, and human beings just like you, but this bill reflects otherwise. The membership is ready and understands change is necessary. However, as you just saw in the presentation before me, our police here in Annapolis have been exemplary. The numbers speak for themselves. Change doesn't necessarily mean harsher punishments, but could also come in the form of additional training and education, helping our police to do their jobs more efficiently and to better serve the communities of Annapolis. These changes should include input from professionals in the field of law enforcement, possessing the training, knowledge, and experience to address the topics at the forefront of modern-day policing. However, the bill in its current draft does not include any input from law enforcement professionals. Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council, we are at a crossroads. You can choose to legislate a solution to a problem that simply does not exist here in this great city, or you can choose to hold the men and women of our police department high, showing the world that we meet our core values: honor, respect, integrity, and service. Thank you.
That was the end of our presentation. Turn it over to the chief for some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank each and every one of my presenters. I say my because I consider them my officers, my supervisors. I'm their chief. Anybody who knows me well knows that I don't have prepared remarks. I speak extemporaneously because I believe that if I'm a leader, then I don't need a script. I should know my people. I should know the culture of my agency. I should know my job. And when I look at Annapolis, it reminds me where I grew up in Baltimore City. I grew up to a single parent, absent father. I guess some would argue that all the stereotypes of an individual who would not succeed, I came from that environment. And I sit here today, and I'll keep my remarks brief, but I want to say this. A guy who grew up in housing, public housing, had the opportunity to study under Dr. Steve Vicchio, one of my favorite professors at Johns Hopkins University and the College of Notre Dame in Baltimore. Dr. Steve Vicchio was a Yale University trained theologian and an ethician, which is one who studies ethics. I'm sorry, ethician. I was practicing that the whole presentation. I wanted to say that fluently. And one of the things Dr. Vicchio taught me in graduate school was the importance of utilitarian ethics. And I never heard of utilitarian ethics. And utilitarian ethics considers the interests of all human equality. So any good leader, whether you're a police chief, whether you're an elected official, whether you're a public school teacher, should consider utilitarian ethics for the very reason I just stated. It places the interests of all human equality. Now, law enforcement, unlike many professions, I know lawyers are governed by the American Bar Association, doctors are governed by the American Medical Association, and so forth and so forth. Engineers, all the professions have their governing bodies to determine what their ethics should be. The only prominent one I'm aware of in law enforcement is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and they adopted their code of ethics in the 1930s during the Prohibition era, when police officers were beholden to politicians. They were called patronage jobs, that if you wanted to be a police officer, you had to agree to do certain things. If they were running numbers or running prostitution, then the officer stood outside in the old days and kept his mouth shut, because if they dared say anything and wanted to honor the oath of their duty, you could cause their termination or worse. And out of that came the Bill of Rights. Now, I would argue with anybody that the Bill of Rights has morphed into protecting bad officers, so there had to be a change. You get no argument from me there. I don't think it's a person in this room under the sound of my voice that's wearing a uniform or took an oath to protect, condones the behavior in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota about a year ago, or what happened to Freddie Gray in Baltimore, or Eric Garner in New York, and it goes so on and so forth and so forth, Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. None of us do. I've never heard one officer, and I'm in the law enforcement community, I never heard a chief, a rank and file officer, anybody to try to mitigate anything that Derek Chauvin did on that fateful night when he made the very poor choice to sit on George Floyd's neck to cause his death. every day I wake up, and this is the truth, I pray for his family. I pray that this verdict gives them peace. I pray that the city of Minneapolis is moving towards healing. But Annapolis is not Minneapolis. Let me get back real quickly as I close. Utilitarian ethics considers the interests of all human equality. I'm going to throw a couple of big words that I'm not going to mispronounce because I'm comfortable now. There's two types of utilitarian ethics, and they pretty much came from two of my favorite Western thinkers, John Stuart Mill, he's a theologian, British theologian, and Jeremy Bentham. And they describe two types, act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. For a real quick example, sometimes the rules are bad rules enacted by government, enacted by the legislature. Martin Luther King marched in the 1960s because you had de jure and de facto laws that regulated how black were to interact in post-antebellum United States. There were actually laws that said you couldn't sit at counters with white people. And it was only because of the act of disobedience, civil disobedience, right? The David Thoreau, the Harvard-educated theologian, who Dr. King based most of his premise off, that if it's a bad law, you're not really obliged morally to obey it. Then you have two types, the act and the rule. And then I'm going to throw a couple other fancy words out there, Dr. Stephen Vicchio. It'd be an honor if you're listening, Dr. Vicchio, just to show off what you taught me at Hopkins. There's two types. There's two theoretical views. Deontological theory says that you have to act at a sense of duty, that if you benefit 5,000 people, but one person's hurt by your act, then it's a bad act. It's a bad law. Even though the other 4,999 benefited from it, if one person suffered, it's a bad law. Then teleological theory says the greatest good for the greatest number. As long as it benefits the vast majority, well, you're going to have some casualties. What I don't want to happen is that we enact, because we have a couple of things that we must do. We must be in compliance with the new bill that the Maryland General Assembly overrode back a few weeks ago. And now we have a set of laws now that we must implement, and we have to transition and look at everything we do now to be in compliance with state law. Then we have a federal bill that's out there, and I don't know whether it's going to pass or not. I'm not that well versed in the federal process, United States Congress, but the George Floyd Act, and that's going to have some regulations that would mandate that police departments all across this country have to implement. And then we have the legislation brought before this council is bringing forth. And so we would have it from all levels of government. And if we're not careful, we'll spend more time sorting out legislation than we will protecting the citizens of Annapolis. So that's my point. Sometimes you think you're doing good. Sometimes the quickest way, what's the proverb? The quickest way to hell is paved with good intentions. And I would like to think that we will really consider, before we pass this legislation, the end game, the end result, because for everything we do, it's going to be a consequence. Now, I didn't know what the union was going to say. I just didn't know. I sat in on the discussions for the PowerPoint, but then at some point I got up and left too as a point of leadership, because I wanted you to hear from the men and women who serve here every day, and it not be Ed Jackson's presentation, because I have full faith in these men and women behind me that they do their jobs and they do it well. As a matter of fact, I can't do my job if they don't do theirs. And when you selected me, and boy, was it an honor, on July 31st, 2019, I see what older folks say. I'm 62 years old now, and I used to have a mind. Remember those days, Stan? I can remember dates and times. I didn't have to write down a tag, because if the boss called it out, I remembered it. I can't do that anymore. But I do remember that date, because it was one of the honors of my life when you all unanimously confirmed me as your chief of police. And I promised you a couple of things. I promised you leadership. I promised you community policing. I promised you that I would operate with integrity. I promised you that we would reform or restructure the police department to meet the needs and the demands that the citizens expect. I said that I was everybody's police chief. Anybody who comes into Annapolis, who lives in Annapolis, works here, comes here to sit in and listen to legislation, enjoy Main Street and all the wonderful restaurants and the natural beauty of the city, it's my job as the police chief. The buck stops with me to make sure we have the best police department armed with the best policies, with the best tools, and most importantly, the right culture, so that the citizens can have full faith that we are here in the spirit of service as opposed to adventure. And so what I don't want to see us do, because a good leader doesn't sit at the table like I'm doing now and engage in rhetoric that's going to preserve their job. A good leader can only do what he's guided by or what she's guided by, what their moral compass allows them to do. And I think if we're not careful, we're going to legislate our way out of me being able to deliberate and engage in utilitarian ethics and do the greatest good for the greatest number, or a sense of duty, depending on the nature of what I'm confronted with. It takes the leadership totally away from the chief. And it's an easy remedy when the police department's not running right, you get rid of the chief. I don't have a long-term contract. I don't have a bunch of lawyers. I don't have a bunch of requirements that I get certain benefits. I'm just here to serve and here to lead a police department. I have more years behind me than I do in front. You can call me young. Well, 62 is young, yeah, but I've never met 62 times 2. So I have more years behind me. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather never lived to be 59. So Ed Jackson, the first one in over 100 years to even make it out of his 50s. And so what I'm trying to say is that all I want to do is lead a police department that you can be proud of, that the community can be proud of, that the men and women that I lead can be proud of. Because if you don't have any followers, you're not a leader. And so, you chose me as your police chief to be the model, to be the type of person that young men and young women can emulate. And so rules doesn't ensure that a police department operates effectively. People do. People with the right credentials, the right bearing, the right mindset, people who know how to motivate people, to hold them accountable. That's what's going to keep us out of off the Justice Department's radar screen, out of the state prosecutor's office. And so far, I think we've done the job better than most. And so I'll end by saying that I'm of the mindset that we have to do our very best to approach the Annapolis Police Department deontologically. That means a sense of duty. I don't want one person to be hurt. That's the goal. I know it sounds utopian, it sounds unachievable, but at least we should strive towards that, right? For those of us who are Christians have said we'll never achieve perfection, but that should be the goal, to strive towards it, right? Didn't say you have to be perfect, you should strive towards it. And that's what we're trying to do here in the Annapolis Police Department. And so I just want you to consider that. I think it's a lot more that we could have said. I know that as a former professor, after a certain amount of time, you lose people. Pedagogy is quite different than angogy. And if you're not entertaining, then a lot of times people lose interest. We have Mike McDonald here. I think you have a couple of platinum records. No, it's the other Mike McDonald. I'm sorry. The Doobie Brothers, Mike McDonald. I'm sorry. But anyway, I just want to thank you for giving us this opportunity. I hope that in your deliberations we've said something that may change the hearts and minds. You have a great police department. That's the bottom line. You have a great police department. Sometimes you got to be careful, if it's not broke. The old adage is, don't fix it. What we should be trying to do is enhance it. So I just want to thank my deputy chief. I want to thank my entire command staff. There's too many people to name. And I want to thank each and every member of the Annapolis Police Department who took the time out of their schedule to come here today. And I want them to know that we're going to keep striving to boost morale, because I think TJ said it best. Everybody has to have morale. Police are no different than doctors or lawyers or any other profession, any other discipline. People have to feel appreciated, feel valued, and feel that they are going to be treated fairly and protected. And that's my job as chief. And I don't think that we need a whole lot of other legislation to achieve that. Thank you, and God bless you.
Well, I can speak for myself and say, you know, I truly appreciate everything you do. We understand the things that you have to do so we don't have to. So I speak for many of us on that front. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to speak. We are at a crossroads in our country. I fear our department doesn't have anything to fear. We are on the forefront of reform, and I want to thank you for being open to that and for trying new things, and we will continue to try new things. So with that, Alderman Gay had a hand up for some questions.
I came in late, so if anybody else had a question before me, I defer to them. If not,
Alderman Payon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, I hesitate to bring this up because I don't want, it's not my intention to deal with dirty laundry in the public arena, but this is a statement, not a question of what you can do about it. But my experience has been that poor morale usually equals poor leadership, and I just want to point out that I think that is something that clearly needs to be addressed absolutely and as quickly as possible. I don't need to know what or anything like that, and I certainly don't need to hear that the messenger has been disciplined or, I'm not big on killing the messenger when it comes to something like that, but it's something that I'm very concerned with, and I'm pretty sure that I share, most of my colleagues share that, at least to some extent, that concern.
Well, I would say this,
if they need help, I think it's up to you to make things a little bit better.
Yes, sir. And I don't mean I get excited about that, but you talk about leadership, that's a very broad term. I think American policing is under attack. I think the poor morale can come from leaders external to the police department. So everybody has their hands in policing. So I think and I'm not speaking for the union, but I think that in large part what the morale problem is the external part of it as well. It's a big part of it. Mm-hmm.
I sure don't want to hear that the messenger has in any way been sanctioned by the department for coming forward, because
no, sir, I'm just talking about how old I am, but for 62 I have high energy, so I'm gonna continue to motivate them, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Alderman Tierney.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have some questions on your presentation, and they're sort of the random speakers, but just quick questions. Mm-hmm. On the CALEA, it was mentioned that you evaluate transparency and accountability. Just very briefly, what is the measurement for that? How do they evaluate transparency and accountability?
I don't think it's a blanket. But while he's coming up, part of that, and I can't underscore that enough, is that when they come here next time, because quality is what the customer says it is, you know what I mean? And the customer I'm referring to is the community, right? Some people like Mont Blanc pens, other people say just give me a pen that can write and sign my paycheck. So a lot of times government tries to tell the community what's best for them, and I argue that sometimes the community should tell us what's best for them. And what CALEA attempts to measure through that process, when the assessors come here, that's why they want to hear from everybody, a cross section of the city of Annapolis.
Yeah, it's such an abstract term that I didn't know how.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Well, if Alderwoman Tierney, the evaluation is conducted through our policies and our procedures, and the way we react to those policies and procedures. They're evaluated by the way we are responsive to the community and the community's response to us. In other words, we have a policy that says, well, I think the chief mentioned, everybody has to take an oath of office. That's transparency. Everybody in this department has to take an oath of office, including the civilians. Theirs is a little different than the law enforcement officers. We write, and our reporting is part of an evaluation process. You know, reports that we write, the proofs that we give to the CALEA assessors that says, this is what we do that comports to the standard that leads to transparency, that leads to, what was the other word you used? I'm sorry. It was accountability. Yes,
yeah.
transparency and accountability. It's written in our general orders. That's what transparency
that's the goal, yeah.
I'm sorry, ma'am?
It seems like they're the goal. It leads to accountability.
Right,
It leads
right.
to.
It leads to accountability. It keeps the department accountable. I sort of equate CALEA standards, if the police department were an entity of itself, a living, breathing entity, then the CALEA is the general order manual for the department. Like the general orders are the manual, or like our general orders are the manual for sworn and civilian personnel. That's the way I like to equate it. I think that's a good way to look at it. And again, these standards, and again, there are 189 of them, and this is a yearly process every year. And then at the end of the 4 years, we have the assessment. And I was remiss earlier, and I thank the Major for reminding me that at the end of those 4 years, the public, as well as the politicians, educators, whomever, is invited to come in and talk to the commissioners via personal attention, or they can call in, they can email, they can write a letter, any way they want to communicate to the commissioners how they feel about the Annapolis Police Department. And this is advertised before these commissioners come here. They didn't come last year because of the pandemic, but the last time they were here, that's exactly what happened. I believe Ms. Berger called in. 2 other people came in person and sat with the commissioners, along with my commissioners and myself, and discussed the inner workings and the function of the Annapolis Police Department and our compliance with the CALEA standards.
And I'll say one real quick thing. CALEA is much like Middle States Association of Colleges and Universities.
Right.
And if you ever taught in higher education, even at the professional level, undergraduate or graduate school, every full-time professor is required to establish a metrics in the course that they teach. And you have to have what you call student learning outcomes and assessments. We call it the acronym for SLOA. And SLOA has a metrics and says that at the end of that period, the end of the semester, the students you should be able to demonstrate, not the student, but the professor should be able to demonstrate through exams and assessment that the students grasp the core competencies as outlined. The same thing with CALEA. CALEA, those standards that a retired Chief Dennis is talking about, the metrics is that say, for example, engages the community. The community feels good about response. Response times are good, things of that nature. You know, police officers are polite, even down to their appearance. They look professional, you know, that they're articulate, all those things. So that's the measure.
Okay. I have 3 quick ones. I'll try to.
Ma'am, one other way, if I may, our website, our public website that has information. Matter of fact, we just uploaded a report from our last CALEA.
Yes, sir.
From our report from last year,
Yeah.
And that website itself that we maintain also represents transparency, accountability of social media, and all these things are measured through the CALEA standards.
Okay. Just these are quick ones, sorry. Someone mentioned 57% below staffing. When you say staff shortage in patrolling, it was patrolling. What is that based on? Is that from adequate facilities legislation when you say you're 57% below staffing?
It was, just to be clear, it was 57% of the time from January 1 through today.
All right,
We had to backfill patrol to meet minimum staffing of 7 officers and 1 supervisor, 57% of the time. That's going to be due to a various number of reasons.
Okay, so I misunderstood. It wasn't like you're understaffed 57%.
No, ma'am.
I interpreted it as that. Okay,
No, ma'am. Just 57% of the time of our daily patrol shifts.
Okay.
57% of the time we have had to utilize overtime to meet minimum staffing numbers.
Okay. 50 cases per detective. That sounds like a lot. How does that compare? I have my prosecutor colleague here nodding his head, but 50 cases per detective? Do they also have to show up at court? I mean, is that efficient? Is that normal?
So the short answer is that's an extremely high number. Now, the difference between Annapolis and other jurisdictions is the Annapolis Police Department does not break down their criminal investigation section with specific detectives handling specific cases, types of cases, because we simply don't have the manpower. For example, other departments, larger departments, generally will have a sex crimes unit, a missing persons unit, a homicide unit, a special victims unit. We're not afforded that ability just because we don't have enough officers. That can eventually become detectives. We don't have enough detectives. So therefore, a detective may be on call for this week, and we always knock on wood because we don't even like to say it, but let's say a serious crime happened tonight, and the on-call detectives or the detectives working, they work till, let's see, today is Thursday. They'll work till 11 o'clock tonight, and they'll go home. There's a serious crime at 2 in the morning. They're coming back in. They're going to handle it. So let's say, say it's a serious aggravated assault. So the very next night, the same 2 detectives are on call and working night shift. If they go home and at 4 o'clock in the morning there's a rape, they're coming back in. One of them is going to handle it. So the cases are, each detective handles every type of case. In a perfect world, we would love to bifurcate or trifurcate, have serious persons crimes, special victims crimes, being sex offenses, things like that. We would love to be able to have just property crimes. We just don't have the manpower. It doesn't exist. So you have 400 assigned cases. Now, I would never try to suggest that every case has the same level of complexity. You may get a missing persons case, detectives begins handling it, and he gets a call from the person's mother and says, hey, just came home. Great, that one took 40 minutes. You may have a case that takes 4 months. It depends on what type of case, the complexity of the investigation, the leads you have, the forensics, which sometimes on a forensics case, fingerprints can take months to come back, whether they're usable, whether there was an identification. A lot of this is systems too. If we recover DNA from a crime scene, we don't know who the perpetrator is, and the detectives spend X amount of time working the case, and we don't know who it is, but we know that his DNA was there or her DNA was there. That DNA is uploaded into the CODIS database. A year later, that database might hit and come back, oh, that DNA you submitted a year ago belongs to this person. Now that case is reopened and the investigation begins again. So the short answer to your question is that approximately 50 cases is astronomical.
And CODIS is Combined DNA Index System. That's what the acronym CODIS stands for. It's a database that analyzes DNA.
Okay. My last question is, you mentioned, I don't know who it was, you mentioned liaisons to county, liaisons to state, and being a multi-jurisdictional area, do those layers impede your efficiency? I just want to know how you operate and what efficiency or inefficiency, and it just seems like there's the fact that you have to have a liaison to the county and you have to have that's what I heard. Does that impede your efficiencies?
It can at times, and Lieutenant McDonald can speak to that better than I can.
So I think you potentially. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're referring to when I mentioned working with federal partners and having task force officers.
Yes.
Okay. We recognize very clearly that the Annapolis Police Department and the jurisdiction, the city of Annapolis, is part of Anne Arundel County. We're part of the larger metropolitan area of Baltimore. We're part of the larger East Coast region. There are crimes that occur in Annapolis and crimes that occur in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in New York that are connected. And if we don't reach out to our federal partners and our partners in other law enforcement agencies, we can't effectively partner in investigating those crimes which have a direct impact on Annapolis. For example, the detective that's assigned, the corporal that's assigned to the DEA HIDA group, he works with, the HIDA group has detectives or local law enforcement assigned from numerous local law enforcement all working together with the DEA to benefit cases that have direct impact on the jurisdiction from which that detective comes. That's why it's a very big benefit to us. There are investigations that are conducted at the federal level that I want to be careful that I don't say things that I shouldn't say in terms of divulging information, but there are investigations that are conducted that have a direct impact on the crime in this city. Not that we're sending our resources off and providing no benefit to us. That certainly would be counterproductive. That's not what we're getting from these. The last example would be, we just recently had a task force officer hook up with the U.S. Marshal Service. When we have, for example, if we have an outstanding warrant for rape, aggravated assault, some serious crime, you've heard about the numbers of the staffing in Annapolis. We don't have a resource where we can directly reach out and say, I need you 5 officers to go find that guy. And that's your only job until you find him. It does not exist in the City of Annapolis Police Department. However, because we're now partnered with the United States Marshal Service, we have the detective who's part of that task force can pick up the phone, call, he can open a federal case through the Marshal Service. That warrant now becomes a federal marshal warrant, and they will send 20 people down here tomorrow to help find that guy, and they'll keep looking for him until they find him. So we benefit from this far more than we give to it.
And as the chief, my fear is because a lot of their policies are different than ours. So if we codify certain things, then we have a mutual aid agreement with a lot of these foreign jurisdictions, if you want to call them that, outside of the city of Annapolis.
Yes. Yeah.
But they have their own policies and procedures, so they're not beholden to us, but they have the authority to operate in a broad sense, especially if we have a MOU with them or a mutual aid agreement. And one of my concerns is that it may harm our ability to provide, to continue to engage in that mutual aid agreement with some of our outside jurisdictions that can come and assist us.
That's my point, yeah.
Yes.
That's my point, yeah, okay. And I'm also learning that you don't have an Elliot and Olivia like SVU to go out at the same time.
Don't work that fast, that's for sure.
You have the same people going out. Sorry.
It's just sexy on TV. They all are glamorous and they all, they all look good and they all physically fit. And I hate cop shows because the public has an unrealistic expectation. That's what they do on TV. They pull screens out of the sky and they take one little fiber and they put it on a piece of glass and they type a few words and it's a multinational terrorist comes up, all this information. It just don't work that way.
Thank you.
And please, if you guys can keep in mind, I know you heard from 3 commanders, and they talk a lot about a section or unit, but listen to the number behind the section or the unit. They're only talking 1 or 2 people. So I just want you to keep in mind when we're talking about a section or a unit, you're only talking about at most 2 to 3 people.
Right.
So it's 10 past, there's a lot of hands up. Alderman Pendell Charles is next, then either Ross or Rob. And then we'll get back to Sheila, and then Dwan said you came in last.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As the City Council's Public Safety Chair, I want to publicly thank you all so very, very much for this presentation, but also for what you do for the city of Annapolis. And as a retired prosecutor in Baltimore City, and a person who actually went to the academy and trained officers, I really want to thank you all and for this presentation. It's been hugely enlightening, I think, for everybody in this room, especially us on the dais. But I want to make one comment. When the chief was responding to Alderman Payon's question about morale, and the chief responded on many external factors, because the camera cannot pick up on this, I've been panning the audience, and at many moments in time, I see a lot of positive head nods. So I want to make sure that the chief and the deputy chief know what's going on in the background that they can't see, as well as what the public cannot see on camera. So I've seen a lot of positive head nods, especially on that. But I see, and I can feel it in the room, that there's a lot of support for what you do and what you bring to the table. And what I've often said is, and I know there's been some angst about those who come from Baltimore City, but there's not too much in Baltimore City that we didn't see that you won't see here. I mean, the number of experiences that lend itself in Baltimore City are huge. And that is not the case here. And I tell a lot of folks, once you move from Ritchie Highway to Poteet Street, it's oftentimes like going from Mars to Venus. It really is. And so the lived experiences that we have in this room, whether it's from Baltimore or whatever the jurisdiction is, I know it has bode us well here in the city of Annapolis. And I've said it more times than I care to repeat again, but this is not a cookie cutter approach. we tailor, and every jurisdiction should tailor their police department to the needs of the residents, the businesses, and the visitors who are here. Yes, we can take some things from other jurisdictions. We certainly can. But there has to be a certain level of personality that we bring to our own jurisdiction. And from what I see and hear, I do believe that that's what we're doing, and we're moving in the right direction. So thank you all so very much. The other one, last thing I want to say, I know we have a Public Safety Committee meeting that we're going to reschedule, but I want to, on the record, say that we will incorporate the testimony that we've heard here today into the record of the Public Safety Committee so that we do not have to rehash this. There are those who are looking at us from TV and from their homes and other places. So I want to incorporate that legally into the Public Safety Committee meeting that we have upcoming. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Annette?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Chief, and all the staff for the presentation today.
Thank you.
It would have been much more helpful to have had the PowerPoint ahead of time. And I have to say that it's very hard to get fire hosed with a bunch of data like this without a framework so to evaluate it all. But we do want to evaluate it. We do want to know what you're doing and how you're doing it. I don't think that wanting to know that shows any sign of disrespect or any lack of force for the police department. I assume that Ms. McCoy has told you about the conversations we're starting to have with the Office of Law and going over the legislation, going over the state legislation. This is a process. Just as you have your jobs, we have ours. We hear from our constituents. And what our constituents are saying to us is, we want to know what's happening in all those other places isn't going to happen here. Now, our gut tells us that it isn't going to happen here, or at least not very much. We do have some episodes. We have had some officers who've come and gone who have been abusive. But what we want to do is to have that dialogue, not a talking head presentation, but a real dialogue to talk about what's going on here, talk about how we can take steps to make sure that we don't have some horrible occurrence here. No rules, you're right, Chief, no rules on a piece of paper are going to stop that. It has to be the spirit behind the words. It has to be the dialogue back and forth. We are the people who are the conduit from our constituents to you, telling you what they're worried about, telling you what we're hearing from them. But we also are the conduit to come from you back to our constituents and tell them, we're working on it, it's a work in progress, but we're okay. You don't have to worry about being pulled over and tased or pulled over and shot or those sorts of things. We have things here, and more importantly, people here who are not going to let that happen. So the last thing I would request, because it's not here, is I would like to get the statement from the union. I sense some anger and frustration in that. We're not insensitive to that. We understand. We understand anytime the state level and the federal level and the city level are talking about changing the rules, that gets everybody a little bit agitated, a little excited, a little bit of, why are they coming after me? So we do have to address that. And I will say, lastly, that I think we have embarked on a very good dialogue with Ms. McCoy, some of the architects of the legislation, and with the Office of Law. We also have now been given the 250 pages of the state changes. We understand there's also not full satisfaction with the changes that the state has passed. We can work through this, but this has got to be a cooperative process and a dialogue. Just throwing up walls and handing out a barrage of information without the sort of the backbone underpinnings of what that information is communicating isn't going to move us forward. What's going to move us forward, I had a very good coffee with one of the officers yesterday, I guess it was. That kind of dialogue is what moves things forward. That kind of dialogue is what gives us mutual understanding. And I think that's what we're looking for. The level, the sea change, there are things that are changing the world and our world in this country and our policing in this country. And we want to be responsive to those changes. We want, like you, we want to be ahead of the curve and make sure that we're not going to suffer the ill effects that have gone on in other communities. And I think we will do that. I think we have done that, and we will move forward doing that. But it's through exchanges of information, it's through dialogue, it's through, and I'll tell you that Ms. McCoy has put us to school. We're learning all kinds of things, and all kinds of information you have that we never see. And a lot of information that really satisfies, I think, is going to satisfy our curiosity, and the level of information we need at our level, which is the policy-making level. We get to make the policies, and we get to hand out the bucks. And we would really like the bucks and the policies to coalesce. And so we're going to get there, but we need to do it through a dialogue. Thank you.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So first of all, this is not what I'd agreed to as the primary sponsor with the city manager on this. And this is exactly why I didn't want this. I wanted this to say factual. The factual part of your presentation was excellent, very helpful information, but it's really, I wanted a chance for the sponsors, and we're going to do that next time. That's why I thought this was going to stay factual. The sponsors to get up and present on our intentions, where we're coming from, what's actually in the legislation. But again, the latter half of this presentation kind of jumped into things with incorrect statements from the union rep, mischaracterizations. This legislation does not make any cuts. And we did consult law enforcement, though not the full department. I sent it to the chief, and we unfortunately didn't hear back until it was too late. So, but the point is, I think, we want to have a conversation with the police department, but there's a right time for that. It's when the public process starts. That's when we have a committee process. We have these work sessions to have these dialogues. We're currently meeting with representatives from the police department. But by coming out with this antagonistic approach, that's not helpful. I mean, the legislation, for after all, it's tried to be framed positively. So, and frankly, Chief, I'm kind of stunned by some of your remarks this evening, because again, this legislation has good intentions behind it. We did not frame this as an attack on the police. We have no intention of attacking the police. We even stated in the legislation, and when we're presenting that, we think our police force does a very good job, and we have great officers. We have not promoted defunding the police. We have not impinged on the honor of our officers. What we're trying to do is build a peaceful approach to try to build upon the trust in the community. Because as Alderman Arnett said, we are elected officials responsible to our constituents. We have to respond to our constituents who have concerns. They want to make sure tragedies are not going to happen locally. Yes, we have a good department, but does that mean we should not do anything to try to prevent things from happening locally? We had a shooting at the Capitol when we thought we were immune from mass shootings. That kind of shows that we have to take action. This is not meant to be any kind of antagonistic approach, but the way this is set up now is the sponsors have had no chance to accept what's been in the paper to really talk with you about where we're coming from. And that's what I was hoping was going to come out through the work session and eventually through the committee process. Because the thing is, something is going to pass. in this city, we have to pass something. We have to show the public that we're going to take additional steps. And I think this is a great step as well, letting the public know what the department is already doing. And I hope that you will provide feedback throughout this process. We want to hear fully from the union representatives and from other officers in the department. But again, we need to set the record straight. There's nothing antagonistic that we were trying to do with this. So we have another work session. We have the committee process, which we want to hear from everybody, but we also need to hear from the public. They are a primary concern of the council, but also I'm sure of the department too. You know, Chief, you talked about the morale of the department, and that's also important, but what about the morale of the public and the trust of the public? That's what we also need to be holding up there. So it's a constant balancing act that we have to do as elected officials to find that balance. And unfortunately, we're off to a bad start right now because again, Chief, when you say you see no need to pass any kind of legislation, I'm stunned to address any of these national issues, because that again kind of has the assumption behind it that you think nothing can happen locally, and what's happening nationally, I think, demands some kind of response locally. And I thought we put in a lot of time in this. I thought we were really trying to take the right approach, but now we're just being well. In any case, this is, again, the beginning of the process, and I do thank you for giving the presentation you did earlier. And as my alderman said, there's a lot for us to get through, but I appreciate the time that Ms. McCoy has been spending with us. What I'm hoping is that we can sit down and get some real, as I said Tuesday, completely willing to make changes. We want to make changes to have this work not only for the community but for the police. So please give us some constructive feedback. We can change it. We have to make sure it complies with the state, but we want to do even more. But we want to hear from you, and I just hope you keep that in mind moving forward.
Alderman Finlayson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I want to thank the chief, your command staff, and everyone who's here this afternoon. You provided us insight which we could never see or understand independently. There's not one of us sitting up here on the dais who's walked in your shoes. And so I appreciate the fact that you gave us the nitty-gritty of what you do and how you do it. We had an opportunity in advance of this legislation to have a work session. I made the request, and I was denied that request. So it wasn't an interest to sit down and work through the details of the legislation in advance of introduction. So we shouldn't play that game. That wasn't the plan. I made the request. Okay? So this is what has happened. We do have another work session, I understand, so that there will be an opportunity to exchange and ask questions. We've run out of time, of course. But, we set the stage. I'm sorry that we are not perceived as leaders in the city, because the chief is the leader of his department. The city manager is the chief of all the departments except for the law department. And we are the leaders of the city. So if morale is bad in the city, we are the leaders. And the buck stops here. So we can't put that on anybody else's shoulders. We determine the budget and everything else that impacts what goes on with our staff, as well as the services for our citizenry. And I keep saying you can't talk about staff without talking about services. I've requested, and it's been honored, that we have a survey from the community so that they can tell us what they value. And we can almost predict what that's going to say. But we have to have it hard data. So we'll find out what that says. We're going to have a task force that investigates outsourcing so we can get the real data on whether the county would take us and what it would take. We're going to get hard data without just talking about it and rumors. You know, you can tell that I'm really frustrated because we have a department, and like any other department, there's nothing totally perfect. Everything needs to be addressed. But to address it without bringing everyone to the table first, I think is a terrible mistake. And maybe that's the union in me, okay? And thank you, TJ. Is he still back there? Excellent job. But I have to ask him, who is the union? You know, because unions have been under attack for a number of years, many years. And the image that is portrayed is that unions are these wealthy guys who are being paid big bucks, and that the rank and file really have no decision or no involvement in the decision making. And that may be true in big unions like the NRA and the Teamsters or whatever. But in most local unions like yours, like the Teachers Association, the members are the union. This is our union right here. The men and women that are standing before us pay their dues, make their decisions, and they step up when necessary to say, treat us well. Treat us like we deserve to be treated. So I just want to be clear, you guys are the union. We need to understand that. This is our union. So when we're dealing with our union, it's the rank and file who are doing the work every day, who can tell us honestly, sincerely, and accurately what it's like. So I just want to say, Chief, thank you for enlightening us, having your staff enlightening us with all the details of what you do and what they do every day, putting their lives on the line for the rest of us. We needed to hear it. And Ms. McCoy, I know that you're going to have an opportunity to weigh in. Alderman Arnett mentioned it several times, when we determine what the state is telling us we have to do. So I look forward, and I hope we all look forward, and we all attend the next session so that we can have an actual dialogue about this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Gay?
Thank you very much. After hearing some of my colleagues' responses, I want to say, if you want a more moderate approach to this peace ordinance to be passed, you might want to do it with this council and not the next one, because this is perfect. It's a moderate, non-progressive, very, you know, so you want to do it now, not next time. So I urge you to get it passed this time around. I would ask my colleagues that we, or the city manager, I requested a closed session. I sent some videos, a number of videos to the TV crew, and some photos that I wanted to pull up from incidents over the course of the last year. I asked constituents to send me interactions that they've had with police officers, or interactions that they've had with police in the city. They've done so, a lot of them. I don't know if they probably wouldn't allow me to play them today because I couldn't blur out faces and badges and all of that stuff, which I'm sure we would have to do. But the public deserves actually to see it. So we'll work that out with the Office of Law. Carrie, I'll talk to you after, and we can figure that out. Because this narrative that we're pushing, that, you know, we're only preventing something that happened nationally from happening here, it's already happened here multiple times, to the point that I wanted to raise the question as the gentleman was going through the slides in regards to internal and external complaints and things like that. Would you say that, and I'll just use a scenario, I won't use names, examples, or anything. I am in my community, I'm growing up as a teenager or whatever, I'm just a young kid, and I see an incident on my block where an individual is handcuffed and beat bloody by police, and this has happened once or twice, right? And so that is the perception I grew up with in policing. Do you think that that would have some sort of impact on how I interact with police and how I report incidents to police, understanding that in those particular incidents, there's never been any just there's never been justice served to those individuals. They don't feel that if an incident happens where there is excessive force used within the department, that they can't complain, because who are they complaining to? The police, and they don't feel that it would be taken seriously. Do you think that may be why there were so few external complaints?
No, I think the reason why there could be few external complaints, because people like yourself won't report them. So if you have information that a police...
You said people like who?
Like yourself.
I've come to you in your offices several times.
Sir, you never came to me. You never came to me, and I opened my door for you, but I know for a fact that you had information.
Mr. City Manager,
didn't
I use your office a couple of weeks ago because there were incidents that I found in the community to be troubling, involving weapons and things like that. I sent a message to the city manager. I did use your office, and I did meet with an officer, and I did show him.
You met with an officer.
Okay.
You didn't meet with me.
Okay. Well, I reached out to you.
But what I'm saying now, in reference,
but you said people like me.
But
I've been cooperative with you.
In reference to what you just said, in reference to witnessing something in videos, if you have information in reference to an officer doing something wrong, then report it so it can be investigated.
If this is a complaint that you're trying to file right now, or information regarding officer misconduct, I'll be honest with you, sir. I don't think this is the appropriate forum for doing it.
I'm not discussing any particular. That's why they're not up on the video or screen, because it probably wasn't the appropriate forum. But I'm just asking the question. Before I was accused of not cooperating with the police, even though I was asking the question that do you believe that some of those incidents may play a role in the lack of trust, as my colleague had suggested, and not coming from the position of like trying to demean, but just trying to get a better understanding, because I too am concerned about the murders that go unsolved and the lack of police trust and why people don't want to come forward and talk, but I'm trying to figure out how to do so. I've come to the police with stuff like, so who do I go to?
Well, sir, Alderman Gay, we can have a conversation. We have had conversation with you in reference to crime that happened in your community, and you have refused to give that information.
Okay.
And we can have this conversation offline.
We will.
But we have several incidents.
We should have the conversation.
Alderman Gay?
Yeah, we should have the conversation offline. Yeah. Or I'd like to speak with somebody who's in charge of that actual department.
Internal affairs?
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to speak with you. I'm not sure what this gentleman's talking about. I've been nothing but cooperative with the police department. In fact, I'm trying to just get a better understanding of how the department works. I went on my first ride along last night. Loved the officer. Loved the experience. To get to know him personally and to get to know him professionally, and he showed me examples of how the technology works. We did traffic stops, all of that. So this belief that I'm up here hating on the police department is a lie, and it's not true, and it pisses me off, because as the only black male council person up here, it continues to feed the narrative and the negative stereotype that African American males don't like the police. And I don't like it, because I have tried to be cooperative with you and your officers.
So, Alderman Gay, one, I applaud you for coming and doing the ride along with an officer. I imagine it was a really great experience for you. I imagine you probably did learn a lot. And I'll say right now, I've had interactions with you out on crime scenes before, where you've pointed us in the direction of individuals who might have information for us, and I do appreciate that. And there are people who come forward and tell us about everything from I saw a car, one of your marked cars driving down West Street, and I think it was going too fast, on a voicemail that they leave us, or there's this web portal. And if the concern is that law enforcement is going to take the source of a complaint and use that to assign some level of validity to the complaint, or how seriously we take it. Complaints can be anonymous. It can just be, here's this information and do something with it. And there's a record of it. And so we're held accountable to it.
And Alderman Gay, let's do this. I'm sitting here listening. Let's you and I have a conversation when it's convenient for you. Let me know. I'm here. Today is Thursday, so tomorrow's Friday. I have a couple of commitments, but I will be here Friday or one day next week.
Okay. But if we're going
And I can meet you anywhere. It doesn't have to be in my office.
Okay, we can walk the neighborhood together. You know, I'm open to it all. I think, like as everyone said, I'm grateful for the officers that do this. Like I told the officer last night who I was with, when we were on our first traffic stop, we pulled somebody over on West Street. My heart was beating like a racehorse before his race. I was so scared because you didn't know what the hell was going on. And the reason we pulled the person over was because of erratic driving and stuff. And I'm like, God, please don't let this guy have, something up in it. You didn't know. And he had a car with no doors, and it was just all of this stuff. And so, again, I'm not coming from the position of hating the police. I'm coming from the position of living in Eastport Terrace and Harbor House for the last decade and seeing a number of things, both good and bad, having interactions both good and bad with community members and residents, and just trying to figure out how we can meet in the middle. That's my thing. If there's some, personal hate from officers or lieutenants, chiefs, whatever, I can't handle that. And I might be here for the next 4 years, so I hope we get to become friends.
So Alderman Gay, I think the short answer to your question is what do we do about that? It sounds like you're very in touch with the community. It does, and it sounds like the answer in how does the police department get the credibility that it needs to have people come forward and file these complaints? You can be that. You can help us with that, right? You can tell people, yeah, I talked to Sergeant Ascione. He's the internal affairs guy over there, and he doesn't mess around. If you tell him that something happened, he's going to look into it. And if he finds out that an officer did something wrong, they're going to be held accountable. And if you project that sort of confidence in us to them, yeah.
Can I clarify something?
Let's use one of those community centers to sit down and talk. That's what those community centers are for. So let's meet next week and talk.
Well, I want to clarify this. I never said that you hate police. Your accusation was because the brutality of police officers that people were reluctant to come forward. My point is that people are reluctant to come forward for a number of reasons. Sometimes they have information and they don't want to come forward. Not because they've seen police be so brutal that they're afraid to come forward and get the information. I never once said that you hated the police department.
We go to Alderman Tierney for the last questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
And we're 45 minutes over, so appreciate it.
I didn't want to go over my quota last time, but I'm trying to correlate what you presented to the legislation. On domestic violence, which you said was the greatest threat, I forgot who said that, and in light of the recent murders in this Maryland city, what do you get the gun? And in a domestic violence interaction, do you find the gun? Do you take it away? How do you handle that? I mean, this guy in this suicide shooting, I mean, there's obviously a gun there all the time with domestic violence somewhere. And, are you legally prohibited in asking questions about it, or just?
Yes, we're legally asked if it's a weapon in the house. And okay. Your question has a lot of, it's no short answer, but to make it as short as possible, in basic terms, if a person has been convicted of a violent crime, any violent crime, Maryland has some of the strictest handguns laws in the United States. Anybody's convicted of domestic violence is prohibited from owning or possessing a firearm. That's a charge in and of itself. If the officer, he or she, is able to articulate that the abuser may use that weapon, even if it's legally registered and we know it to be in the house, we can seize that weapon. Now, that person can file a claim and go to some type of arbitration, and the judge will decide whether he or she will get that weapon back. So anything that we do to preserve life, and we can justify preserving life or avoid serious injury by use of a handgun, we can seize it.
Okay. And Alderman Tierney,
yes,
I just wanted to add,
in my former life in another department. I commanded a special investigations unit, and before then, I had the family crimes unit, which was investigated domestic violence. And one of the things, or some notes, and we'll be working, and I'll be Alderman Arnett. I'll be taking you back to school. Is that one of the things that I talked about was being very, very careful not to codify policy, because I watched as when I first went to family crimes. There were some things that I thought we had a sound policy, and then lethality came, and it got better. And then protective orders changed, and it got better. And now the seizing of handguns, and it got better. And protective order changed again. And so I worry that if you codify a specific policy like domestic violence, our ability to be able to rapidly change and meet the times will be hampered. And, so we will get into all of this in our sessions, and we'll be able to talk about that, in depth. But I just want you to think about that. Why,
Because it's fluid. It's a fluid situation.
Yes, that, policy changes and it evolves, and we are evolving in law enforcement for the better. And so if, that's why, we on specific policies, we wouldn't want to codify them, because we do not want to stifle our ability to evolve.
Some of the most important case law that's been rendered by the United States Supreme Court came at the hands, and we can talk about it another time, of officers that didn't cover policy. But officers had to make a quick decision, and then the justices ruled on the reasonableness of that officer's decision. And so I'm just kind of backing up with what Rhonda just said. If you codify it, you lock it in. And then I would hate to say we could have done something else, but the policy didn't cover it, and lives were lost or people were injured. So that's what we have the appeals court for, to determine whether it violated, offended the Fourth Amendment or, some other amendment to the Constitution.
I'm sorry, but
yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, the whole point of trying to codify some of these general orders, the provisions in there, is because we don't want policies to change that quickly, these internal regulations to change that quickly. The council are the policymakers, and we think if you really want to build trust in the community, I think they would want to know that these certain standards are set in the code, that they can't just be changed on a whim, on the fly, without any kind of oversight to their actual elected officials, right? And if there are provisions that you think, I mean, that's open for discussion, of course, but that's the whole premise of, to build trust, you have to have that transparency and that balance. Things cannot always happen behind closed doors. The public needs to know when changes happen.
Okay, and my last question is, do you have a no tolerance policy? I didn't hear the word tolerance. No tolerance. You do. No tolerance on. Well, you spoke a lot about internal affairs and all that, but from a chief standpoint, do you have a no tolerance dictate on anything that happens internally that is? Do you give your officers a second chance?
Yes, some things, some violation of policy is due to poor training, lack of understanding of the policy. Some of it is for a whole myriad of reasons. But every police officer who comes into police service, there's certain offenses that there is no tolerance. If you steal, there's no tolerance. If you, if you're a rapist, or if you do something that would be a felony or a serious crime in and of itself, as a sworn officer, there's no tolerance, because you have no more credibility in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
You can't raise your hand, and testify in court. There's case law to support that too. And so it depends. Your question is a broad one. It's a good one, but a broad one. So it depends on the offense.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. But a whole lot of offenses, we can't no longer keep them in service if they violate it. And those were those examples I just gave you, real serious crimes or real serious acts of discretion, throwing away evidence, purposely throwing away evidence, that kind of harm, we have zero tolerance. But you miss court, you get in a car accident, or it's a whole lot of things, because we're humans and we make mistakes. But when it's willful, deliberate, with malice or forethought, then you have no place in the Annapolis Police Department, and you shouldn't have any place in any other police department.
And that's covered under the disciplinary matrix.
What, Rhonda?
That is covered under the disciplinary matrix. So we do have a matrix. We've had a matrix for over 7 years. We thought it important. The state thinks it's important as well, which we'll get into those conversations where they'll set a universal matrix for all police departments.
And it's progressive. So if the same officer comes back and does a violation, and we saved him, and he or she comes back and does it again, then the punishment is not the same. So the matrix is progressive.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to have to call it here. We've got a committee meeting on here afterwards. So this is the start of the process. I want to thank everybody that's out there for giving time today. We do truly appreciate you. Thank you for working with us. We have to see how the peace bill interfaces with the state legislation, the federal legislation. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, and we appreciate your openness to that. And we want to know this city council does appreciate you. I know you think it's a political class thing, but we're not all politicians, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I haven't adjourned yet, so do you want to? We're going to do the official. Okay, meeting adjourned.